I look forward to it," Bowen replied. By this time, the dwarf managing the arena had rushed into Richard's room, raising his voice as he exclaimed, "You've blown up the R." However, his words remained unfinished as he was cut off by the 10 coins Richard threw over. He frantically picked up all the coins, rubbing his eyes hard and counting them repeatedly. He then spoke cautiously, "2 of my guards died as well, sir. They were elites, amongst the bravest, most loyal, and most handsome warriors of the Bloodstone tribe." Richard threw over another 20 gold coins and asked nonchalantly, "Is this enough?" "Enough, it's enough." "That's too much," the dwarf said, picking it all up frantically. Richard's chair turned around and he faced the dwarf. "Really? That's good. Alright, now, my warriors faced a sneak attack by marksman in your arena. How are you going to account for this?" The dwarf was startled, and his eyes quickly turned a few times. He finally smiled in response. "You see, many people died in this arena because of you. I suggest you just let it go." Richard's gaze remained level as he said indifferently, "Let it go? Are you saying that my elite warriors are the same as these useless guards with no power? I don't think that's how the Bloodstone tribe sees it. Is it a rule of your arena to allow the defeated to ambush the victors as they wish? Is that the reputation of the half-orcs?" The dwarf was surprised, not expecting Richard to be so well-versed in the laws of the camp. The last sentence had been quite profound, and his smile grew even more flattering. "You are wise, my lord. Of course those ordinary people cannot compensate for your loss, but you will obtain the goodwill of the Bloodstone tribe. I believe that is far more important than a few gold coins. As for those despicable scum, they should be condemned and punished." Seeing the knight's wound taken care of, Richard stood up. "Punishment? Very well, I believe in the goodwill of the Bloodstone tribe. Let's go." After waiting for Richard to make it far away, Bowen, Sharon, and Howie all left after exchanging glances that seemed to speak volumes. Once he was back at the inn where he lived, Richard immediately changed into clothes that would allow for swift movement. He then issued a quick series of orders, and moments later dozens of warhorses galloped out of the inn and into the darkness. On both sides were wind wolves running at a similar speed as well. Although they'd exhausted their wind blades at the battle at the blockade, Flosan's vigor spell combined with half a day of rest had given them the energy to use the ability once more. The person at the front of the cavalry, right beside Richard himself, was actually Sam. His hand was pointed ahead, towards the location of Mark's lair. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 65. Vengeance. The Blood Scythe and his forces occupied the entire block, along with the surrounding areas. The most important part, the spring's mouth, sat right in his courtyard. Besides the taverns nearby, Mark's only income was through a single casino. However, despite it being prime time, there were barely any people here. Richard mulled over it for a moment, concluding that this definitely wasn't due to the incident at the arena earlier in the evening. News of that definitely wouldn't have spread so quickly. It seemed like the business wasn't going well for some time, which should be why he'd sent Sam to collect a toll outside Camp Bloodstone. With Mark's personality and the way he handled affairs, it would be a surprise for him to ever improve the casino's profits. Bloodstone wasn't considered particularly big. It took but a few minutes at full gallop for Richard's army to reach Mark's base, and although the advancing soldiers alarmed nearly half the camp, the attack was so sudden that the half-orcs were barely alerted before Richard and his troops were long gone. At the entrance to Mark's base, everyone was just dismounting as the trolls made it over as well. Medium Rare sped up with a wave of Richard's hand, throwing himself towards the entrance with a bellow. He leapt up as he was about to make contact, ruthlessly smashing his hammer into the gates. A loud rumble sounded out as they gave way, detaching from the frame before flying out into the yard. Smoke and dust rose from the ground. As he stood before the main entrance, the remnant page of the Book of Holding appeared in Richard's hand. 5 direwolves charged up in the next moment, brutally attacking anything in sight that was moving. Cries and screams of alarm filled the air, turning the entire courtyard into a mess. The sentries along the wall had been dozing off. The attack was so quick that it was only now that they realized something was amiss. However, 2 arrows screeched through the darkness and buried into their throats, stopping them from shouting out. Richard calmly stood at the gates and cast Nature's Beckon, spawning 5 more wolves that caused even more chaos. As the pack of 10 wolves pounced around in the yard, Richard started to chant the spell for the all-too-familiar fireballs. However, several of his men started to look at him with peculiar expressions. Magic affected everyone in a melee, including the allies of the caster. However, Richard's tactic allowed him to cast without restraint. This was not the first time this had happened, an array of delayed fireballs engulfing even his own summons. It was likely that someone unfamiliar with him would suffer disastrous damage if they charged forth, but the reward was as great as the risk. The target of the fireballs this time was the second floor of Mark's residence. 3 fireballs all landed around the same area, detonating at the same time and turning the blood sight's cries of surprise into calls for help. Waves of fire engulfed the entire courtyard in a flash, even as tongues of flames spewed out of the windows. As well built as Sam was, he trembled as he stared at the scene before him. It wasn't long before his quivering legs gave way, leaving him to land on his bum. Richard pointed into the courtyard once the fire died down, and his men threw themselves inside ruthlessly, starting a massacre. Dozens of wind wolves circled out back, leaping over the walls to attack the enemies from behind. A few minutes later, the battle cries slowly started to fade. Mark's tall, sturdy silhouette appeared in the courtyard, staring at Richard, who was by the gates. Beams of hateful rage shot out of his eyes, and with a scythe in each hand he rushed towards Richard after roaring wildly. The blood scythe staggered with every step he took, his clothes already soaked crimson. Yellow light flashed over him before he could take more than 2, a spell from tiramisu that slowed him to a third of his original pace. Dozens of weapons then stabbed into his body, the shepherd of eternal rest plunging into his back. Right before he drew his last breath, however, Mark roared and took a few more strides to everyone's surprise. However, a sacred flame descended upon him from the sky, and he immediately screamed in agony. He staggered aimlessly a few more steps, before collapsing head-first into the ground. The weight of his body caused him to slide forward quite a bit, stopping right at Richard's feet. A snow-white handkerchief slowly floated down onto Mark's head, and immediately after Richard stepped down as he grinded his feet on his fallen foe's skull. Flozen happened to walk out of the yard at that moment, witnessing the scene. She whispered into Richard's ear, assuring him, "There's no enemies around you now, you don't have to do this." Richard stopped what he was doing, and without even batting an eyelid quietly reached out and pinched her butt cheeks with all his strength. However, Flozen didn't cry out as she spoke calmly, "These are all our men. You don't need to do this either." This started to stifle Richard's breathing once more, even though he'd just gone back to normal a while ago. The battle was long over, but the raging fires continued to engulf Mark's 2-story residence. Ola lugged a huge chest out from amidst the blaze, also carrying about a dozen sacks of all sizes on his person. The elf was extremely sensitive to the scent of wealth. Even the hidden stores of experienced nobles could not escape him, let alone the blood scythe who had naught but muscles in his brain. He walked over to Richard's side, handing him the chest before kicking Mark. "This fellow is a pauper. He doesn't have more than 300 coins. Richard turned to Gangder, "How many survivors?" Shrugging, Gangder replied, "Most of the survivors are amongst those who ran at first chance. There's only dead and crippled people in the courtyard, and they couldn't run if they wanted to. Forget about captives, boss." Richard realized the hidden meaning behind Gangder's words, finding that there had been a problem with himself. Since he was already at the Bloodstained Lands, there was no need for him to capture enemies and turn them into his soldiers. Golden slaves would work much better. Richard agreed with a nod, pointing at Mark's body. "All right. Bring him along, we're heading back." Everyone mounted, and Mark's body was thrown on the back of a horse as well. They made their way back to the inn without a hurry, noticing a wave of heavy and chaotic footsteps in the distance. Half-orc soldiers came out of the corner, stopping Richard in his tracks. These were warriors of Bloodstone, the core force maintaining order in the camp. They'd actually made it quite quickly, but all they could do was stand in Richard's path. He'd already finished what he'd set out to do. Before Mark could treat his wounds after escaping to his base, Richard had already taken his troops out to kill him. Of course, this wouldn't have been possible without Sam's help, since he knew Mark inside out. Without the fellow leading the way, Richard's troops would not have acted so quickly, and it would have required more effort to win the battle. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 66. Vengeance, 2. Richard reined in his horse, sizing up the half-orc warriors standing in his way. The longer he took to observe, the more information he would receive about his target. There were a total of 8 Bloodstone orcs stopping Richard, each about 2 meters tall with the levels between 6 and 8. However, with their innate strength they were similar to warriors a level higher in combat. However, 6 to 8 and 7 to 9 weren't much different to Richard's group. There were 2 mages in their party, and orcs had pitiful resistance to magic. The leader took 2 steps forward, pointing at Richard's nose. Human. You've killed at Camp Bloodstone, and Chief Stormhammer doesn't like trouble. You're to come with me now. If he is free he will interrogate you tomorrow. Orc. Dare point at a mage that way again, and your arm will instantly be severed, Richard answered apathetically. A few orcs immediately showed looks of terror, and some even retreated. Mages were terrifying to orcs, their existence second only to the evil dragons. However, the leader roared in fury, "Are you threatening the brave warriors of Camp Bloodstone?" But even if his snarls were fierce, the hand he'd used to point at Richard lowered. Mages were evil and terrifying to orcs, and the legends had made them out to be omnipotent. They could render the most powerful warriors impotent forever, a punishment more frightening than death itself. Threatening a mage will result in far worse outcomes, Richard said with a hint of laughter. However, the half-orc warrior didn't seem to think the same way. However, he hummed and finally conceded, "You burnt Mark's residence. You should at least let us know what happened, no?" Richard waved his hand, and a foot soldier lifted the corpse's head to show the Orcish warriors its face. "It's the blood scythe," one of them cried in alarm. The violent and powerful fellow was notorious in Camp Bloodstone, but now he'd fallen into the hands of this young and handsome mage. It was unknown whether he was even alive. Mages were truly terrifying aberrations. Richard spoke leisurely, "This fellow lost a gamble to me at the arena, but he wasn't willing to pay up. I had no choice but to collect on the debt myself. His life can be considered the interest he owes me." The half-orc scratched his head, at a loss for answers. From the standpoint of maintaining order, it did indeed make sense to enforce debts. Such disputes occurred every day in Bloodstone, and every once in a while some lives were lost. The problem here was that Richard had created a big mess, and from the looks of it he'd killed off the Bloodsight's family as well. Just as they were at a standstill, a short, stocky figure hastened over from the distance, calling out from his location, "Sir Richard, Lord Richard. Wait, I have something to say." This was the dwarven host of the gladiatorial ring. He ran till he was gasping for breath, but even 10 or so meters away he couldn't wait as he spoke out, "Mark isn't someone to be trifled with. Sir Richard, please do not be too rash." "Ah!" The dwarf was stunned. He had seen Mark's corpse. His gaze seemed to stay on Mark's face for an entire minute, and only then did he gulp, turning to look at Richard. At that moment, the charming face seemed no different from that of a devil. Richard looked down at the dwarf. "These brave warriors of Bloodstone do not want me to return. I remember you promised me some goodwill as the price for not pursuing your poor management of the arena. But of course, The dwarf quickly replied, darting over to the leader and saying something. It seemed like the dwarf was regarded highly by the Bloodstone orcs, as his explanation was accepted without objection. The captain led his small team of warriors and left. Richard shook his head slightly. So the orcs just left like that? It seemed like this dwarf had quite the status, and Mark wasn't all that liked either. However, he had only used a small portion of his mana, and the might of most of his subordinates had not been displayed. He'd wished for the warriors to be more forceful, so he could test the abilities of the Bloodstone orcs. However, since they were smart enough not to provoke him, he would not indulge in competition. Richard then chuckled aloud, guiding his horse ahead till they reached the inn safely. Numerous pairs of eyes spied on them from the shadows along the way, but seeing Mark's corpse none dared make a move. Returning to the inn, Richard patted Sam on the shoulder. Well done. Ever since he'd come to Failure, he'd found himself liking people like Yeoman and Sam more and more. They could do many things, and were of great use as guides. He then had people hoist the Blood Sight's corpse up, bringing it to the room Zendral currently resided in. Zendral had stuck to his position as a prisoner along the way, not stirring any trouble. Their interactions during this time told Richard that this necromancer was someone who valued trust and promises, arrogant but stubbornly persistent in mage tradition. Since he'd defeated the man properly in a magic duel, Richard had gained his respect. The power of the Book of Holding was still viewed as a part of Richard's own power on Failure. Here, the use of magic equipment was alright in a duel. There were few mages in this plane, all of them of high position, and they monopolized the production of any powerful magic equipment. Thus, they showed off the importance of such items in duels, and the more powerful the equipment a mage could use, the more respect they garnered. After all, one still needed mana to activate such equipments, and acolyte skipping levels to use powerful items was impossible. Thus, the art of magic battle involved a perfect combination of both mage and equipment. In other words, the 5 direwolves Richard had summoned had given Zendral less of a shock than the single page from the Book of Holding. Entering Zendral's room, Richard had the corpse placed on the floor as he smiled. Zendral, I've found you some fairly good material. Zendral's eyes flashed and he crouched by Mark's side. He took a careful look and then sighed in praise. This is a very sturdy warrior. His body and bones weren't damaged much, and if processed well he can become the perfect Dark Knight. He might even grow more powerful than he was when he was alive. However, the fire in his eyes immediately died out. It's a pity that I'm only a prisoner. If you are willing, you don't have to be one, Richard stated. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 67. The Path of a Mage. You want me to capitulate? Zendral asked seriously. Richard shook his head in answer. Mage tradition ensures that your life has belonged to me ever since you lost the duel of life and death. Seeing Zendral look like he had something to say, Richard preempted him with a wave of his arm. I know, you can give up on your life whenever. But before that, I want you to think this through seriously. Is there any meaning in that? Are you willing to give up on the most mighty dream of mages, give up on exploring the boundless mysteries of magic, give up on possibly making contact with the gods themselves? What about leaving Failure and exploring the boundless plains? Those are things mages take pride in, goals they persevere towards. The necromancer was completely taken by Richard's words. He hadn't ever heard or considered what the young noble in front of him had just mentioned, but once he thought it through he realized that this was the attitude all mages had to have. Touching upon the mysteries of the gods themselves? Even as a necromancer, he didn't have the guts to dare attempt it. And then, Richard had given him another prospect to think about, exploring the myriad planes. He'd never thought such a thing would be possible, but coming from Richard's mouth all this seemed like a given. It definitely wasn't something the youth made up. At that moment, Richard was an imposing mountain in Zendral's mind, one which he could gaze upon but whose peak he would never find. Richard's words had been simple, but the things he had spoken of were quite significant for the future of a mage. These were paths that could be walked very far in the future. Indeed, it was so far off that this mere level 9 could not have found out on his own. It showed that his inheritance and knowledge with respect to magic far surpassed the peak of what he himself had learnt from Phaler. Of course, that was a given. Even in Norland, the magic inheritance of the Deep Blue was of the highest caliber. The knowledge of anyone from the Deep Blue streets would likely surpass that of Phaler greatly. Do you speak the truth? Zendrol's voice trembled as he asked a question he himself knew to be foolish. What do you think? Richard asked back with a smile. Zendrol had grown so emotional his face was completely red, but a moment later he sat down with disappointment, hugging his head. But I am a necromancer. Richard understood where that dejection came from. If I did not consider you a true mage, I wouldn't have agreed to the duel. Nor would I have used a divine tool like the page from the Book of Holding from the beginning. Zendrol was stunned by these words. He looked up at Richard before slowly standing up as he finally made up his mind. What do you need me to do? Richard muttered to himself for a while before speaking up. I search for supreme strength, the sort of power that surpasses the limits of this world. I need you to give your all for its sake, carrying out my every order as I make it without question. I believe all your doubts and questions will be answered, but you will perhaps continue to discover more unknowns. I can release you from the confinements of this plane. I can allow you to explore what is beyond. There is still a long path ahead that even I know nothing of, and the search will be very long. However, is it not this very charm that is worthy of our very lives in an effort to investigate the mysteries of magic? The necromancer's eyes continued to brighten with Richard's every word, as if a blueprint of the massive and magnificent world of magic had been laid before him. He looked at Richard, done speaking and merely watching him with a smile, and composed himself. There is one more thing I need to remind you of, my lord. I am a necromancer, and in the eyes of the gods we are heretics that must be burnt at the stake. We work with the souls of the dead, and that is a domain no god will allow to be violated. If I join your party, you might end up wanted by many of the large churches. Richard burst into laughter. Don't worry. I have the guts to cooperate with demons, so what do necromancers matter? I've never planned to cooperate with the gods of this plane, and I'm not afraid of their pursuit. Zendrol nodded sternly, kneeling halfway. In that case, I am willing to follow by your side as you seek supreme strength. You have my loyalty, my magic, and an army of undead. He then followed up with a magic oath, one of the most restrictive at his level. While these weren't nearly as powerful as slave contracts, going against that oath would lead to a permanent drop of a level. Thus, the higher level the mage was, the more restrictive this oath would be. Richard smiled slightly. Then this corpse is yours. I hope a powerful warrior of darkness will join your army in the future. You shall not be disappointed, Zendrol answered. Good. Do give me a list of any magic materials you need for your research. My subordinates still have a batch of many materials. Having said this, Richard left Zendrol's room and let the anxious necromancer begin working on resurrecting a warrior of darkness. Once he was out of the room, Richard saw Flozen waiting with half a smile on her face. He beckoned to her, and she followed him up to the second floor and entered his room. She only spoke after closing the door. It's such a pity that you aren't a priest. Whether or not you really have faith, your ability to muster up followers is enough to make you great at the job. Richard pulled her into his embrace and gritted out, if you dare tease me further, I'll rape you. That's impossible. Her slightly hoarse voice was enticing as always. Richard's eyebrows shot up. You think I don't have the guts to do that? Her upper body leant backward slightly in response, showing off her perfect breasts. It's obviously not that. I'll be doing my best to cooperate with you, so how would you call that rape? Richard was so frustrated in that moment that he was left tongue-tied. Flozen grinned, looking up to plant a light kiss on his lips. There's actually no need to wait for the day before we return. If one day you're truly certain you can bring us back, that's fine as well. At that point, I'll do my best to resist. The raging inferno within Richard's body was ignited again with her words. The arm fastened around her grew more tight as he asked, "So what about before I have this absolute confidence then?" "I just told you," came the reply, "I'll do my best to cooperate. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 2, Chapter 68. Inspiration. Richard's smile faded as he shook his head, letting go of the priestess. He moved over to his table, attentively examining a piece of hide placed upon it. This hide had a complete magic formation etched into it. Oh? Getting ready for work? Flozen did not seem to let Richard go. Richard brushed the hide lightly with his left hand. The sensitive touch of his fingers could reveal even the smallest flaws on this rune. This would be its final inspection. This is the rune I prepared for Gangder, an elementary strength rune. Even if it's only grade 1, it's quite suited to him. It'll complement his Gaia bloodline quite well, giving his enemies a big surprise in battle. This doesn't seem to be a normal elementary strength, Flozen said suddenly. Richard was slightly surprised, but at this point he was already used to her vast knowledge. He explained, "There's some variation to the structure of this rune. It only activates when needed, and the amplification goes up to 50% instead of the standard 30%. The disadvantage is that stimulating this requires strong intent, and it consumes energy at twice the normal rate. Even with Gangder's stamina, he can only sustain 5 minutes in this berserk state. However, when fused with Gaia's force, the instantaneous boost in battle will be heavy. Even enemies who were originally equal to him will fall at his hands in that period." "That sounds similar to your bloodline ability." Richard nodded. "Yes, it was inspired by eruption. However, my bloodline shouldn't be limited to that, and even eruption itself continued to grow stronger as I grow. This rune," Flozen touched this hide like it was a work of art. She seemed to think of something, looking more and more surprised. "I've never heard of a rune like this that can boost one's natural abilities." "Richard, you've created something amazing. Isn't that a little bit of an exaggeration?" Richard asked with a smile. "This isn't all that much better than an elementary strength rune, but the energy consumption is substantially higher. The passive boost to strength has become active and triggered, but there isn't too much significance to that. "No, it's not that simple," Flozen shook her head. "What if you consider this rune an ability? There's almost no difference from eruption, outside of the degree of amplification. How many people in the myriad planes have bloodline abilities? It pales in comparison to the number of people who can bear runes. Runes that can simulate bloodline abilities are considered to be grade 3 at minimum, but you've used a grade 1 rune to accomplish the same. Have you thought of using a similar method to simulate other grade 3 runes? If you can achieve that." Richard was shaken by those words. Flozen had opened an unprecedented path before him, and all the grade 3 runes instantly flowed through his mind. His strong foundation from 5 years of study at the Deep Blue was put to use, as he solved many problems one after the other. He discovered he could simulate more than half the grade 3 runes he knew with grade 1s, if he could give up enough efficiency. Even some grade 4 runes weren't impossible to simulate. And at that moment, another vague idea passed through his mind like lightning. He seemed to grab hold of something important, but it also seemed like nothing at all. "Richard!" Flozen called out, but he immediately quieted her with a wave of his hand. He was staring out the window, but his gaze was fixed on nothing. His brain worked at great speed, trying hard to capture the inspiration he'd just gotten a flash of. However, this information was so complex to handle that even with his blessing of wisdom he started experiencing a severe headache. But even as the splitting headache seemed to take over, he suddenly understood. Why were standard runes even designed? Most rune masters started off by creating standard runes, using them as a basis to design rune sets according to the physical requirements and restrictions of the user. Standard runes existed because these were old, matured designs that had undergone hundreds and even thousands of years of improvement. A considerable level of balance between stability, performance, capacity, and usage had been found, and they thus became a foundation for the mass production of rune knights. However, it was impossible for standard runes to completely suit everyone's requirements, and powerful high-leveled people wouldn't be able to exhibit their full powers with standard runes. Thus, true runemasters customized rune sets based on the user's characteristics. Runecrafting was a mixture of both art and science. Standard runes were utilitarian, scientific, while custom-designed runes were an expression of art. The grade of a runemaster also depended on their artistic ability. It was only then that Richard understood why so many art subjects had been added into his course at the Deep Blue. Rigorous and open artistic training had ended up showing him a new path, no, a brand new world. Art has soul. A rune set could consist of one rune or quite a few, but regardless of that count, the entire set had to become one with the person that used it. They needed to make a complete package, with the same theme and the same soul. Richard quickly raised his head to look at Flozen. "Thank you." Flozen looked seriously into Richard's eyes, a smile slowly forming on her face. It wasn't a slight grin like normal, but a full, brilliant, and beautiful beam. It was only then that Richard realized how charming this priestess was when she was smiling merrily. The current Flozen was gorgeous beyond recognition. "You should," she tapped lightly on his chest with her fingertips. "You're quite gifted, with many valuable qualities, but your character is such a problem. You're introverted, persistent but proud. Sadly, you're extremely sensitive and fragile. At times you even seem like a poet, always hiding yourself as you drown in depression and grief, as if everything from the myriad planes has hurt you." Richard blushed and exclaimed angrily, "Flozen." Flozen stuck out her tongue and said quickly, all right, I won't say anymore. "Actually, you always lack confidence." Richard quickly pinched her face and laughed, "But I seem to have confidence now. So thank you for giving me most of that confidence." Flozen snorted, straightening up, "Of course. Conquering women is the fastest way for a man to gain confidence. And whoever conquers me will have a lot. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 2, Chapter 69. Favor. Richard held up the hide once more to closely examine it, before carefully placing it back on the ground. "I have an idea, but I need a bit more inspiration to come up with a rune that I can call my own. This rune has many memories that make it worth keeping, but I'll just give it to Gangder." "All right. Also, what next now that Mark was destroyed?" Flozen asked. "Are we taking control of his lands or do we have a discussion with the rest of the powers here?" "There's no hurry, let's just wait. Stormhammer will look for us." Richard carefully tucked the rune away as he set up the tools to build a slot. "Why Stormhammer? Why not someone else?" Flozen was relentless. "Because he's the boss." Richard wasn't distracted by the conversation, continuing to use both hands precisely and smoothly as he built the slot. "Are you going to talk about an alliance?" "It isn't necessarily an alliance. We might just strike a compromise, or merely sound each other out. We're foreigners. If we want to carve some space out for ourselves, we need to observe what the Bloodstone leader is like. Why not just wipe out the Bloodstone orcs and take the camp for ourselves?" Flozen made a murderous suggestion. Richard broke out into uncontrollable laughter, hitting her once on the head as he said, "Why would we want to take over such a lousy space? For those few springs?" Stormhammer is a level 14 warrior with more than 100 level 7 or 8 half-orc soldiers under him. If he had the right equipment or a bloodline ability, even with a sneak attack we'll lose more than half our troops. Who do you suggest should die first? Me. Flozen's words always made him both love and hate her. Richard clenched his teeth and grabbed hold of her collar, but on her end she actually propped up her chest and seized the opportunity to wiggle her waist, loosening her robes. It seemed like she had spoken the truth. Before they were sure about their return, she would fully cooperate. However, her actions were too much for Richard to take. Was it a sort of rebellion? When that thought came to mind, he could barely control himself. It took a while for him to return to normal, chasing the priestess out before going back to the work he had on hand. Gangder was large and strong, so the slots themselves didn't need much work. Roughly 2 hours later, he'd finally finished it. At that moment, Ola walked into Richard's room. The news he bore wasn't surprising, but it came faster than he had expected. Bloodstone orcs had come to their inn, inviting Richard to lunch the next noon with Stormhammer himself. It was quite the etiquette for a bunch of half-orcs. The elven poet did not forget to add his own derision after the report, looking down on the creatures who tried to act noble but never even cleaned themselves. The meeting with the most powerful leader of Camp Bloodstone was held at the central castle. Unlike the rest of the Bloodstone orcs, Stormhammer looked more human than orc. He was roughly half a head shorter than the average warrior of his tribe, but one could see his muscles were dense and hard as iron. His head was almost bald outside of 3 black and white pigtails, and from outward appearances he seemed to look like someone who was over 50 years of age. However, this was only due to the tough conditions in the Bloodstained lands making its residents look older than they actually were. It wouldn't be too much of a stretch for Stormhammer to only be in his early 40s. The two seemed like real nobles having lunch, both seated at opposite ends of a long table. However, this was where the similarities came to an end. The table only had barbecued meat and strong alcohol on it. This was considered a feast in the Bloodstained lands, but even a titled knight from the human kingdoms could host a banquet that was infinitely grander. Still, Richard maintained impeccable manners that wouldn't lose out in the parties of the most prestigious nobles. Most unbelievably, he looked calm and joyful, completely unbothered by the fact that the plate was chipped, the table had holes in it, and even the wineglass hadn't been washed clean. He completely immersed himself into the act, as though this was a real grand banquet. Yet, the entire demeanor was a facade. He was already watching the half-orc on the other end of the table through his peripheral vision, bracing himself for whatever may happen. Stormhammer had been radiating a strong sense of danger from the start. If he ignored his own safety to launch an attack on Richard, his knights would not have the time to save him. It took until they were halfway done for the man to finally ask, "Mr. Richard, you're a mage yourself, but you also have another mage in your party, That is right," Richard nodded in acknowledgement. The half-orc's face stirred with emotion, but he quickly suppressed it to continue his questions. "I hear that great mages are skilled at manufacturing magic artifacts?" "I'm no great mage," Richard said with a smile, "but I'm almost at that level. As for your question, the world of magic is very vast, and no mage is skilled enough to understand all forms of magic well. If you wish for magic accessories, that is the job of alchemists. If you want something you already have enhanced, that falls under the purview of an enchanter. Even roughly, there are more than 10 main divisions of magic." Stormhammer was startled, not expecting there to be so many different and complicated fields of magic. The half-orcs did not have any traditional inheritance in the field, and what little knowledge they did have came from passing visitors. He had been under the impression that any mage could manufacture magical equipment. He paused for a while to look at the graceful smile of the young mage seated across him, deciding to get to the point. "I am 41 years of age this year, and growing my power through exercise has become a difficult task. I need a magic item, whatever it may be, to put me on par with a level 15 warrior. Is there a way you can help me with this?" Richard muttered to himself for a while before speaking up. "It isn't implausible, but such a thing would need a lot of materials. In addition to that, it might require a lot of time." He paused at that moment to notice that Stormhammer had waved the need for materials away. "It would not be a problem. Also, I would like to know what aspect of your abilities you need to enhance. This is crucial. It will allow me to tailor the item to your requirements." The moment Richard brought up his need for resources, Stormhammer's eyes had lit up with unconcealable glee. In the Bloodstained Lands, a high-stakes proposal signified the possibility of a successful partnership. He wasn't worried at all about being cheated. The mages of this world had an excellent reputation. Any powerful mage treated promises and trust more seriously than their own lives. Moreover, he himself had an absolute advantage in strength, which would make for the cornerstone of a successful partnership. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 70. Favor, 2. Seeing that his wish of many years might come true, even the powerful Stormhammer could barely contain himself. Hearing Richard's conditions, he immediately explained, in the stone forest west of Camp Bloodstone is a powerful beast called the Fleeting Shadow. It is a mutated demonic wolf, possessing power so great that my 2 strongest sons died at its hand one after the other. Even with my strength, I can only match up to it, unable to kill it at all. I need the power to exterminate it. I am in my prime now, but in a few years my strength will begin to decline. If I don't kill it now, I never will. Pointing to the half-orc warriors on either side of the man, Richard asked, "You have so many warriors here. Why don't you take an army with you?" Stormhammer sighed in reply, "The Fleeting Shadow is extremely cunning, as smart as any human. It will accept my lone challenge, but if I bring our warriors it goes into hiding. Even the most experienced adventurers who are adept at tracking cannot find it. Besides, the terrain of the stone forest is extremely helpful to its combat style. It appears when you least expect it to, launching a surprise attack. None of my elite warriors can withstand a single full power blow from it, so be it our own operations or with outsider help, no one can get rid of it. It simply treats the place like its property, coming to the camp to hunt in winter or during droughts." Richard was taken aback by this. The elites of Camp Bloodstone were warriors on par with his own troops, reaching level 10. Of course it was another matter altogether in actual combat, Norland's inheritance of training and strategy making them 2 levels higher than those from secondary planes. Richard's team knew how to complement each other, all of them professionals with valiance and extraordinary might. They could take on 2 Bloodstone orcs of the same level and emerge victorious. However, both parties weren't much different in terms of body strength. If the Fleeting Shadow could take out an elite warrior of Camp Bloodstone in one blow, the same would hold with his own men. He paused in thought for a moment before speaking up. "If it is just to raise your power to make you on par with a level 15 warrior, and it only needs to be activated in combat, I might be able to help." Stormhammer's eyes lit up. "Even if it's temporary, I want it. As long as it can last 10, no, just 5 minutes will do." "What do you need, Mr. Richard?" "Not just the materials you need, I can give you anything." "This deal." "What do you need from me?" Richard leaned back into his chair, looking very relaxed. "I need a lot of things. Large numbers of warriors, slaves, horses, and basic equipment. I also need magical materials, rare minerals, and other exclusive materials from the barbarian ancestral spirit planes. I also need a map of the Bloodstained Lands that details the distribution of power, the more detailed the better." "This is all I came to the Bloodstained Lands for. How much of it can you offer for this deal?" Stormhammer thought it over for a moment before declaring, "We have some magical materials, and ore as well. They were left untouched because none of us knew how to use them, so you can take your pick. As for warriors, I can lend you 20 powerful ones. I only have a detailed map of the areas around Bloodstone, with the map of more remote places not as accurate. But before all that, might I know how you plan to raise my power? Is it a set of magical armor, or a formidable scroll?" "I do not have a set of armor with me, nor do I have an enchanter. As for scrolls, one that can raise your power by an entire level has to be at least at the 6th grade, something I likewise do not have. Even if I did, you would not be able to use it. It is none of the above. In fact, I have an even better option for you. Gangder." Richard gestured to the brute. Gangder took a few steps forward, arriving beside the table. What can I do, boss? Test your strength with the respected Stormhammer over there. While you're at it, give your new rune a try as well, Richard instructed, subtly shooting a meaningful glance at the man. Gangder nodded, ripping his shirt apart to reveal the magical patterns on his right chest and shoulder. He took large strides towards Stormhammer, extending his right hand. Stormhammer sternly sized up the man in front of him, secretly assessing his level before he stood up and got into position as well. His hand held Gangder's with complete ease. Letting out a roar, Gangder began to exert his powers. However, Stormhammer's body only shook slightly before he was stable once more. Orcs were normally gifted in strength, and Stormhammer was already level 14. Although Gangder was equivalent to a level 13 human warrior himself, he couldn't do anything to make the half-orc budge in arm wrestling. After all, this fellow was strong enough to exceed even a level 15 human warrior. However, Stormhammer was still taken aback by this level of strength. He could already tell that Gangder was only level 10. After a few attempts that resulted in complete failure, Gangder suddenly bellowed loudly. The rune on his body suddenly lit up, and brilliant rays of light spurted out from the magic formation. A surge of tremendous energy rushed forth like a tide, quickly exceeding Stormhammer's resistance. The half-orc stumbled backwards, bellowing loudly as well. His body ended up flushing red as he brought forth his full power, only then managing to resist the brute's force with some difficulty. All right. Richard called for the two to stop, pointing at the rune on Gangder's body. This is called a rune. It is a technique that is known solely to my family. Now, let's talk about its price. Stormhammer nodded, looking at the formation with astonishment. He'd felt the formidable strength that it had brought forth quite clearly, combining with Gangder's own strength to form a raging force that almost could not be defied. If he could have such power. The half-orc leader's gaze began to blaze in anticipation, and he could almost see the next time he battled that wolf. He led Richard to his warehouse, piling all the valuable resources he had collected over the years for the mage to pick. When he saw a box of 20 magic crystals, his eyelids twitched a few times without control. However, when he then saw a yellowish-green ore with tiny crystals embedded in it. This was crystalline yellow steel, and there was at least a kilogram of it, Just as he reached over to pick up the crystalline yellow steel from the ground, another material tumbled down from the pile of items. It looked like an ordinary piece of amber, but the interior was covered with veiny patterns. Holding the fist-sized piece of amber in hand, Richard could smell a faint smell of flora. His fingers trembled slightly as he recognized what this was: maple amber. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 71. Trade. Crystalline yellow steel and maple amber were very rare materials that were used in the crafting of Grade 2 runes. The former came from unusual ore veins, while the latter could only be excavated from ancient ruins. Both were extremely scarce in Norland, sold by the gram. This piece of yellow steel alone would be 100,000 gold back home, while the large maple amber could be sold for twice that. His intelligence reports also gave him some understanding of the economics of this plane. 20 magic crystals could be sold for nearly 10,000 coins, but that was only in the human empires. Because of how rare mages were in their monopoly on high-end magic equipment, few people purchased these things in bulk. There wasn't much demand from apprentices either. And in the Bloodstained lands, such top-notch materials were worth even less. Because of the chaos and control of the place, transportation costs themselves normally made for a third of the price. Even with all these goods, one needed to stay alive to be able to ship them out. Thus, it was considered rather decent for this batch to be sold between 3,000 and 4,000 coins. Back in Norland they would be worth up to 20,000. The fact that so much yellow steel and maple amber could be in Stormhammer's stores without being segregated into their own piles meant that these materials were rather common in this plane, and they had limited use here. The prices indicated that this plane wasn't very advanced in alchemy, incomparable to the splendor of Norland. Richard remained composed as he pointed to more than 10 materials including the crystal and yellow steel and maple amber, inquiring about their prices one by one. Sure enough, both were only considered mediocre, priced at 200 to 300 coins. The magic materials in Stormhammer's resources were worth a little more than 10,000 coins total, and with open trading channels could be sold back in the human kingdoms for nearly 30,000 gold. Even by looting the Church of Valor, Richard had only acquired less than 100,000, but at this small camp on the outskirts of the Bloodstained lands he'd gotten so much. This land clearly had ample opportunities. Of course, these opportunities also meant the Bloodstained lands were rife with fighting. This tribe of half-orcs wasn't even proficient at magic, but they had such an abundance of materials. It was obvious how these things were collected. Had he not portrayed aggression by executing the blood scythe without pause, Richard felt like his own materials would have added to this pile. Stormhammer was only negotiating with him because he revealed formidable magic. Back in Norland, all these materials would be worth 500,000 coins. It was only now that Richard realized the true profit of planar warfare. It was ultimately a trade for rare goods between both planes. Richard picked out all the materials he could use in addition to the box of magic crystals, worth about 8,000 coins in total. All that, and 20 adult fighters. Stormhammer hesitated slightly, but eventually the half-orc waved his hand. The materials were all wrapped up and tossed to Richard, after which he asked in a low voice, "When can I get my goods?" 3 days later, but I'll need to activate it for you myself as well. That will take another day to complete. Stormhammer smashed a nearby desk with his fist, speaking in a low voice, "I have waited 5 whole years, a few more days won't matter. But I hope you won't let me down." Richard seemed oblivious to the half-orc's murderous glare, weighing the bag in his hand and tossing it over to Gangder as he spoke lightly, "I'm an esteemed mage, and as such I treasure my reputation. The world of magic is incomparably mysterious, not something ordinary people can understand. I would like to remind you that it is extremely foolish to doubt a mage." Another thud, and Stormhammer's beard blew in the wind. His muscles writhed in anticipation, but he eventually restrained his fury and did not act any further. He merely glared harshly at Richard. 3 days. I'll be waiting. Richard nodded, taking his generous profits along as he left Bloodstone Castle. When they returned to the inn, Richard clapped Gangder on the back and said with a laugh, "Well done." Gangder grinned widely as he burst into raucous laughter, "I'm an expert at this. I've fooled my enemies into thinking I'm weaker than I am way too often." The brute had only activated a little more than half the powers of the rune while wrestling Stormhammer, the boost not even reaching 30%. However, the half-orc had been fooled into thinking that it was the peak of his power. This big fellow had turned purple in the face, the vein on his neck throbbing violently, but it was all an act. He'd even drenched himself with sweat, so much so that he nearly wet the ground he was standing on. "Get used to your new rune, there will be more in the future," Richard said before carrying all the materials back to his room. He would sort and organize his immense profit, and with the inspiration from Flozen he also had a few new rune concepts that he was lacking the materials to act upon. With this and the resources he already possessed, he could make 9 standard runes instead of 4, or 6 of the new runes he thought up as well. However, just before he headed upstairs he saw Waterflower's figure flash by. From behind, the young lady seemed a little forlorn. However, this doubt only flashed for a moment in his mind. Richard returned to his room and sorted out his new materials, setting up his tools to prepare for Stormhammer's rune. The rune he was building retained the basic function, but severely lacked in all other areas of performance. The surface area tripled, but Stormhammer's back was broad enough to fit such a large rune. The parts of the spell formation that required more expensive materials were omitted where possible, while the circuit that lowered the capacity requirement was completely removed. Lastly, the rune was designed to be active and not passive. The demand for capacity exceeded that of a grade 2 rune, and the energy consumption was 1.5 times higher than Gangder's. However, the final boost was only 20%, and even that was not stable. The only unique part of the design was an absorption array for embedded magic crystals. This allowed the mana in the crystals to activate the rune, one crystal allowing for about an hour and a half of activity. This meant the rune could only be fully activated 9 to 10 times. Of course, the purpose of this was not to improve the rune's functionality. On the contrary, an array absorbing energy from magic crystals was far less complicated and required far fewer materials than other methods like those based on warrior's energy, mana, vitality, or even spiritual force. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 72. Trade 2. The magic crystal array wasn't just to simplify the design. Someone like Stormhammer, who had no knowledge of enchantments or magic in general, would be more impressed by it than plain-looking animal hide, even if the hide itself was the true representative of Richard's skill. In fact, if the rune was tattooed onto skin like in Flosan's case, it would look quite unassuming for its power. Even when activated, it would only cause a dull glow. However, Richard did not need to have Stormhammer display the full power of any rune. In this plane with no runemasters, even the 20% amplification would astonish people. A 40% increase would not be much different in effect. Rather than building a more powerful rune with 6 times the resources and 8 times the crafting time, it would be more fruitful to beautify it and just make it look stronger instead. This would require some delicate touch-up that made it look complicated enough for anyone looking to forget the actual effect. Richard had studied art for a long time, so such designs would pose no problem. The additional time and effort spent on the task were so negligible that this way might as well be less complex. The elven blood in him contributed as well. Elves were historically known in Norland to be superior at producing flashy items. In Failure, this attention to aesthetic would be equivalent to doubling the strength amplification from the rune itself in terms of selling price. Those weren't the only reasons to make the rune look intricate. The spoils of war they'd seized in past raids indicated that the mages of this plane took pleasure in using the design of their equipment to denote status. From staffs to scrolls, weapons, and other magical products, they all looked exquisite and beautiful, reflective of their status as high-end goods. To Stormhammer and most others who had seen magic artifacts before, this intricate design which displayed the working of the magic crystal was undoubtedly an extremely advanced artifact well worth 10,000 gold coins. When Flosan knocked and entered at dinner time, the rune was nearly finished. This thing wouldn't even be worthy of being called a defective product in Norland, but it had been sold at a price equivalent to 400,000 gold. It only took Richard 3 hours and less than 1,000 coins worth of material to do this, and that included the hours spent in art. In comparison, the rune on Gangder took up a week of Richard's time, with the materials being 5 times as expensive. When Flosan laid her eyes on the product, she immediately let out a low cry. This thing. This rune. Crude. Richard laughed heartily. There's no need to produce quality goods for Stormhammer. We just need to match his expectations, and he only needs 5 minutes of a level's worth of boost to his strength. Flosan nodded, but she was unable to take her eyes off the newly crafted rune. The thing looked really shoddy, a stark contrast from Richard's usual works. One familiar with the youth would struggle to believe that this trash had come from his hands. In her eyes, all those beautiful lights and patterns were unappealing. They were all redundancies to be removed, and the only clear thing was the simplistic formation that formed the rune's core. To her, the perfect rune was one that used the minimum number of strokes. However, despite this being such a shoddy piece of work, the lines and curves were precise as ever. The core of his style still remained. Flosan knew Richard had the proper idea, but this rune seemed like a seasoned artist deliberately imitating a child's scribbles. It made even her unwavering mind feel a twinge of discomfort. It took her a while to settle down and ask, how much did this cost? Less than 1,000 coins, Richard replied calmly. That's so cheap. How? Flosan was shocked. Any rune in Norland cost at least 10,000 coins to make. Now it seemed like Richard was benefiting greatly from his partnership with Stormhammer. What about the amplification? 20%, and it's activated by a magic crystal. She understood that this was a way to limit Stormhammer's capabilities. After all, he was a strong level 14 warrior. Even in a Norland army he would be an officer, and with a proper rune he could become a rune knight. With the capabilities of Richard's current army, a level 14 rune knight would easily wipe them out. But despite all that, despite agreeing with his actions, the priestess still felt that this rune was an extreme eyesore. Still, she settled down and opened a magically sealed box that she'd brought with her. She took out 3 magical scrolls from within. These are some scrolls I prepared for Stormhammer. The first is a blessing, the second a magic shield, and the third is a heal. They can all be used by normal warriors, and are considered grade 3 scrolls. Spell scrolls? This time, it was Richard who was shocked. He stared at Flozen reproachfully. Do we need to give him such valuable items? Aren't you afraid he'll use them and turn on us instead? Why don't you have a closer look? She laughed faintly. In response, Richard carefully opened the healing scroll and studied it. He was a master of enchantments, and his perception had long reached great heights. It took him a single look to realize that even if the material of the scroll was grade 3, there were pathetic amounts of mana within. The spell composition was different from usual as well, especially one unremarkable alteration. Before he could ask, Flozen spoke up. These are modified from the spells I obtained from the church. The spells are well and proper, but I only added enough mana in for them to be activated. The scroll will draw on Stormhammer's own life force to run, and each scroll will shave as many years off his life as their grade. With one at each grade up to 3, that means a full 6 years off if he uses all 3. I asked around, and the average life expectancy of the people of this plane is shorter than on Norland. It's rare for them to live up to 60 years of age, and with Stormhammer being over 40, this will shave his battle capabilities away. Richard let out a long sigh, carefully stowing the scrolls away in fear of accidentally activating them. It had taken large sacrifices for him to get the 20 years of life from the Eternal Dragon, and accidentally activating these things and losing 6 years of that would be extremely unfortunate. With these sinister scrolls being adapted from the Church of Valor's scrolls, even the church's insignia was intact on them. Flozen paid attention to detail, so this was definitely intentional. From an outsider's perspective, this signified that one needed to pay a high price to cast the spells from the God of Valor, losing their lives to him. The church's scrolls could in fact only be used by clerics, but nobody would believe that. With that thought in mind, Richard cast a deep look at Flozen. It's a good thing that I'm not your enemy. Flozen smiled slightly. But you want to be my man, that is clearly worse. With that, Richard was rendered speechless. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 73. Ritual. 3 days later, the addition of the scrolls to the rune clearly surprised Stormhammer. Flozen repeatedly emphasized that the dignity of the God of Valor could not be violated, and any ordinary person activating these scrolls would pay a hefty price, but the stricter her warning, the more determined the hot-blooded half-orc grew. At the end, Stormhammer personally chose 20 of his warriors for Richard as final payment for the rune, and thanked him for the scrolls as well. This group made for almost a third of the young elites of Bloodstone, and were it not for the scrolls, Richard would likely only have gotten a troop of old, weak, sick, and lame soldiers. Of course, he would have to wait until Stormhammer killed the fleeting shadow for them to truly obey him. Early the next day, Stormhammer left Camp Bloodstone under a starlit sky, walking alone on a path of revenge. Richard took control of the new warriors the moment he left, wiping out the remnants of Mark's influence and taking control of the spring he used to own. With such a precedence and the alliance with Stormhammer, Howie, Sharon, and the rest maintained a silence that tacitly acknowledged the change in power. He then began research on Red Cossack. It turned out that the Red Cossack wasn't merely the name of a person, but of one of the largest trade groups in the bloodstained lands. Any group that could prosper in this chaos was actually more terrifying than the bandits and horse thieves, more fierce than the orcs, desert people, and barbarians. Without being more vicious than all these groups, they would not be able to survive in the bloodstained lands and expand their influence. Red Cossack was one of the largest slave trade groups in the bloodstained lands, with a guard troop comparable to a standard army. With more than 5,000 warriors, the army was like that of a human earls, but with the constant fighting in the bloodstained lands, the individual warriors far surpassed common soldiers. Besides, that wasn't even their strongest combat force. That honor belonged to the slaving parties. Most slaves shipped out of the bloodstained lands were powerful barbarians and desert dwellers who were good at battle, with the occasional orcs as well. The slavers worked all year round, and all of them were bloodthirsty hunters. The vanguard he'd sent ahead had encountered a border guard of the Red Cossack. Of course, the title of border guard was just in name. Most of the time, they acted as horse thieves. The red armored knight leading them was actually quite infamous. The name of Red Hook and his cavalry was known to many people even outside the bloodstained lands. A small flame shot forth from Richard's palm, lighting the few pages of information he'd acquired on fire. He watched as they burnt to ash. Red Cossack. Looks like a pretty good target, and I have a righteous reason too. You snatched 100 horses, so I might as well wipe you out, Richard thought, as he casually summoned a gust of wind to blow the ashes out the window. It took 5 days for Stormhammer to return. The half-orc's skin had turned an abnormal green, and he had many more wrinkles on his face now. It seemed like he'd aged 10 years in the mere 5 days, his 3 braids now far more gray than black. Although he stood with his head held high, one could see a faint hunch in his back and sensed the added weight to his steps. Despite all that, however, the aged half-orc had glistening eyes. The huge enchanted hammer that he'd named after himself was in his left hand, with a wolf head larger than a lion's lifted up in his right. His leathern robes were torn everywhere, and many open wounds could be seen under the cloth padding. Stormhammer stood at the gate of Bloodstone, holding the wolf head high as he screamed with all his might, "This is the fleeting shadow, the mighty beast that ate a dozen of our brave warriors. Its head is now in my hands, can you see?" The warriors guarding the camp's entrance howled one after the other, clashing weapons or hitting their chests with their fists. More and more of them gathered, and Stormhammer continued to hold the head up high. Every raise of his arm was met with loud cheering from the half-orcs, and the cheering grew even louder as it spread throughout Camp Bloodstone. They really are a group of heroic warriors. That Stormhammer isn't bad either, Richard praised sincerely from the top floor of their inn. Flozen spoke calmly from beside him. "Do you feel regret for letting him use my scrolls? If you have even the tiniest bit, do think of the origin of those materials he gave us." "No, this isn't regret." Richard's gaze remained fixed on the half-orc as he went silent for a moment. "I was just reminded of something. If I fight in interplanar wars for a long time, I don't know if I will change. I don't know what I will change into. I will not let you lose direction as long as I am around," Flozen said confidently, a smile on her face. "I'm not saying I'll lose myself. Rather, I might grow cold and bloodthirsty," Richard explained. "That, isn't it inevitable?" Flozen looked at Richard innocently. Of course, her bottom was pinched heavily in return. Stormhammer sent someone to invite Richard and his men to their tribal celebration soon after he returned to Camp Bloodstone. And before this banquet, he specifically invited Richard to their sacrificial ritual. The altar of the Bloodstone orcs was buried deep underground in their castle, centered around the statue of a strong orc warrior. This seemed to be the strongest fighter in their history, Bloodstone himself. Once he broke through to the ranks of saint warriors, the entire tribe was named after him. There were several other statues as well, smaller but about the same size as ordinary orcs, that surrounded the altar. These were great warriors in the history of the tribe, those like Bloodstone who'd also become saint warriors themselves. Stormhammer originally had a glimmer of hope to have his statue join these ranks, but his vengeance against the fleeting shadow and his desire for the tribe's survival had led him to use Flosan's scrolls. This had completely ruined his hopes of advancing. Richard was the only outsider in the underground ritual hall, the rest being the strongest warriors and smartest elders of Bloodstone, making for a dozen-odd orcs in total. Stormhammer began by singing a sorrowful and vigorous war song, placing the head of the fleeting shadow on the altar. All the orcs sang in resonance, surrounding the altar as they started a powerful ancient war dance. The steps were clumsy yet powerful, the voices hoarse yet majestic. Richard's heart began to throb to the strong beat, and he gradually seemed to fuse into the ancient and mysterious atmosphere in the hall. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 74. Ritual 2. Once the singing came to a close, the head started to tremble. The clot on the neck broke apart, blood flowing freely once more to rise up the altar and converge at the hammer beside the sculpture's leg. It eventually permeated into the statue itself, giving it a life of its own. Richard faintly felt a strong consciousness awakening within. The statue's eyes turned a blood red, its gaze seemingly sweeping across everyone in this ancestral hall. When it looked upon Richard, the eyes abruptly grew exuberant. Richard felt a disturbance in his mind like a thunderclap, as if thousands of ferocious lions were roaring at the same time. He was jolted in an instant, his vision going black as he nearly lost consciousness. However, a few strong minds immediately entered his own mindscape to help fight off this imposing will. They managed to eliminate the invader immediately, freeing his mind. The orc ancestor could not stand up to the combined might of Waterflower, the broodmother, and his slaves. Unexpectedly, the broodmother's strength of will surpassed that of even Waterflower herself. Zendrol, who had buried his head in research, was also made aware of the battle, and joined in to assist. However, his oath was much weaker than a true contract, and the fuzzy connection didn't let him transmit too much of his power. If not for that, his strong spiritual force as exhibited in that swamp battle would have dealt a heavy blow to the invading consciousness. The spiritual battle ended in a flash, and Stormhammer and the remaining orcs suddenly felt great pain in their brains as they collapsed to the ground. By the time they recovered from the shock, they discovered that the wolf head had dried up to look like a desiccated corpse. The statue had stopped glowing, and the lingering energy from the ritual had disappeared. Stormhammer dizzily pressed into his head, staring blankly in the direction of the altar. The fall had left him throbbing with pain all over his injured body, so intense that his face distorted. He looked at his men as they did at him, but none were able to figure out what had actually happened. They ended up concluding that the sacrifice had summoned the presence of their ancestors, but they were too weak to accept that might. The elders and warriors regained their composure quickly, while Stormhammer himself limped his way towards Richard. The half-orc gazed solemnly into his eyes. "Majestic mage from afar, your assistance has allowed me to kill the fleeting shadow, and in doing so avenge the fallen warriors of our tribe. You have seen our rituals, and from henceforth shall be considered a friend of the Bloodstone orcs for eternity. We may not be strong, but if the need ever rises you can trust us to lay our lives down for our friends." As he said that, Stormhammer reached out with both arms to give Richard a hug, completing the ceremony. Feeling that powerful embrace and looking at the withered face and injured body, Richard felt an inexplicable sensation in his heart. Had he made a rune similar to Gangder's, Stormhammer would not have had to use Flosan's scrolls to win. He would not have reached the end of his life so quickly. And yet right now, the half-orc proved to be a true warrior, a qualified leader and trustworthy friend. However, he suddenly remembered Flosan's words earlier in the day, that the resources he'd been given had obviously been acquired from somewhere else. There was a considerable amount of blood behind each item, and Camp Bloodstone itself was not known for its hospitality to commoners. Many deaths had occurred under Stormhammer's charge. Several strange feelings mixed together, leaving Richard at a loss as to how he should judge the Bloodstone orcs. He ended up just sighing silently in his heart, remembering his own identity as an invader. The Bloodstained lands were chaotic and cruel, but they still held a childlike purity. It was hard to tell right from wrong. Before leaving the ancestral hall, Richard looked at the sculpture once more. The consciousness should have been dealt a heavy blow, returning to the depths of the statue to recuperate. He'd felt a strong hint of divinity within that consciousness, the only reason it could contain the remaining will of bloodstone. This was Richard's first experience with the power of ancestral worship. He now understood why the brood mother would want these idols. It wanted to suck out this divine power from within. However, for now at least, he did not want to touch the Bloodstone tribe's altar. In any case, as far as I can see, there are countless tribes in the Bloodstained lands and beyond that practice ancestral worship. I just need to slowly seek them out and I'll be able to find many. As for Bloodstone, I can just wait for Stormhammer to die and figure things out then. He won't be living much longer anyway. Such was the way the young mage consoled himself, rationalizing the situation. The ritual was followed by a tribal celebration. Several bonfires were burnt in the semicircular arena, and barbecued meat and shoddy liquor handed out. The orcs surrounding the bonfires danced their war dance to the beat of the drum, stopping every now and then with a stomp of their feet as they raised their chests and bellowed a war cry out into the sky. This was a tradition passed down from ancient times, an oath to their ancestors that they would protect their homeland. Once tired of the dancing, the orcs would sit down, eating meat and drinking alcohol to replenish themselves before they joined their brethren once more. The banquet that night played host to a number of special guests. Apart from Richard were the two trolls as well, having prepared a big pot of fragrant meat soup for the occasion. The standard of the soup alone qualified medium rare and tiramisu to call themselves gourmets, but till date this was the only dish Richard had seen them cook. It seemed like this was the only thing they knew. The only thing Richard couldn't stand in the midst of all this merriment was the alcohol. He was forced to drink 3 full bowls with Stormhammer, each bowl sized for orcs. He also had a bowl each with the Orcish elders and then one with each famous warrior of the tribe. By the time it all ended, Richard had to be carried away on medium rare's back. He wasn't completely drunk, but the churning of his stomach made him feel weak and it felt like his brain was on fire. All prudence and apprehension vanished in this daze, but the drinks had netted him a considerable reward. He came out with 30 half-orc warriors, not 20. Unfortunately, the 10 additions were only ordinary soldiers and not elites. Medium rare had a steady gait and his back was wide and flat, but Richard still vomited twice on the way back to their inn. Throwing up made him feel a little better, the cool wind of the late night freshening up his mind. However, the alcohol still burning in his blood made his consciousness foggy. As they traveled, Richard started thinking about the next day. There was not much reason for them to continue on in Bloodstone now, and the insignificant stream or even the entire camp weren't his true goals. They weren't even good enough to be considered a start. Besides, he was an invader after all. Camp Bloodstone wasn't far from the human kingdoms, and if Nyan decided to send an army into the Bloodstained lands, his current forces would be in significant danger. Eshen's strength and the fearlessness of the paladins even in the face of death had left a lasting impression in his mind. Had that been a direct battle, the victory would have been bitter. Since he'd already reaped his rewards from Bloodstone, it was time to go even deeper. By the time he decided on their path, Richard found that they were at the entrance of the inn. He finally mustered up the strength to walk on his own, and thus waved the trolls away to get some rest. Sleep was more important to trolls than humans, their power grew depending on how well they slept. His already empty stomach started to churn again, making him feel like throwing up. He dashed across the hall and opened the back door, preparing to find a corner to relieve himself in. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 75. The First Visit. As soon as he entered the backyard, Richard suddenly felt a strange feeling envelop him. He quietly stopped moving, using the door to prop himself up. The yard of the inn was quite large, and the presence of the stables and lots of junk made it look very disorderly. A ghostly white figure was flying around under the night sky, gliding across the air as if it was water. Her eye-grabbing white outfit looked fuzzy as the air seemed to glide around her, as though gray lightning dancing around her body. This was Waterflower. Richard quietly stood beside the door without disturbing her. The young lady seemed not to notice, moving around the messy backyard without issue. She was fast as lightning yet completely quiet, blended into the night sky and its surroundings. Judging from her speed, she'd leveled up, but even then she would need to have acquired a skill to reach this limit. It took an unknown amount of time for the girl to finally tire, appearing in front of Richard with a flash. She lifted her tiny face, fixing her gaze onto him. Richard looked closely at her as he asked, "You upgraded in level? And you have a new skill, dot." Waterflower sounded her agreement, speaking slowly yet awkwardly, "Level 10 now. New skill. You could call it Windwalk, it's what I showed just now." There was a wild side to the girl's pure eyes, but there was something else in her gaze as well. She still had that scraggly short hair she cut herself with her sword, and the awkward and rigid tone showed how seldom she interacted with other people. Even now, as a member of Richard's party, she was no different. These few sentences were enough for Richard to finally realize how much he was neglecting his soul guard. She seemed like a lone wolf, always carefully avoiding humans, but he just hadn't taken the initiative to get to know her further. He muttered inaudibly to himself for a while before speaking up, "Windwalk? It seems powerful. I'll come look for you in a few days, let's see if I can craft a suitable rune." The young lady's eyes brightened up for a moment, but she remained silent and only nodded her head. The alcohol seemed to be fading from Richard's bloodstream by that time, but the headache started to grow worse. The pain was extraordinary, as if something inside him was tearing his mind apart. He let out a low groan, rubbing his forehead as he waved at Waterflower and proceeded up the stairs to his own room. The Orsish alcohol was disgusting, but it was strong and the hangover was violent. He struggled to bear with the intense pain as he got back in his room. He scanned the entirety of his room out of habit as he entered, a habit cultivated under Naya's tutelage in the deep blue. Whoever one was, being attacked at random every few days as you entered the room would imprint such a habit onto oneself. This was merely habit, however, and once he was done scanning the room, Richard prepared to throw himself onto the bed. However, his body suddenly grew rigid as all his hairs stood on end. His breathing came to a halt, and he scanned across the room inch by inch from left to right. Details about the things he usually ignored grew clear and magnified. Now he could confirm the anomaly in the illumination in the bedroom, which was darker than usual. Even with the clouds covering the moon and stars, some light normally seeped into the place. It should not have been as dark as it was. He tried to look over once again, this time concentrating on the shadows everywhere. He was finally able to make out the outline of shadows slowly making their way towards him from the other end of the room. He exhaled slowly, shifting his body to the right. 2 meters away, the nameless sword was standing erect against a corner of the wall. The shadows seemed to sense the unusual movement, however, suddenly coming to a stop. Richard's heart filled with an overwhelming sense of danger as the shadows began to converge onto a position. A creature that looked like a tigress appeared in the room, a smooth black figure made of formless shadows. A pair of faint red dots blinked into existence on its face, watching Richard with a cold stare. All Richard saw in those eyes was a cold desolation. There were no emotions behind that hollow existence, none of the intimidation a predator put on its prey. It was merely empty. In the short period of time the shadows needed to take form, he'd taken the opportunity to glide 2 steps forward and get his hands on the hilt of his blade. His heart immediately calmed down as he managed to identify this being and subconsciously go through the information he had about it. This was a nightmare panther, a low-level nightmare creature known for its speed and cunning. Even as the lowest tier of nightmare creature, however, it still carried all that came with that name. These beings spent most of their time traveling the void between planes, braving the violent energy within. It was strong and mysterious, unlike a planar being, with even the weakest of nightmare panthers being between level 11 and 12. Their intellect also far surpassed other beasts, the median of their intelligence comparable to shamans and mages. Higher-level nightmare creatures were smarter than legendary beings, some even more clever than demigods. The panther in front of Richard crouched low, bending forward in preparation to attack. However, just as it was about to raise its paws, a strong smell of sulfur burst forth from Richard's body, and a silver full moon flashed into existence above his head. The edge of his longsword started blazing with the power of the silver moon, the tip flying out to strike at the creature. Eruption and a secret sword of silver moon. Richard had brought all he could to bear in but an instant. The nightmare panther had already leapt forward, but it still awkwardly maintained the same crouching stance in midair. It fell onto Richard's blade, as though it had sent itself to its death. The sixth secret sword, Snow Moon. Silver moon force pervaded the area, forming a spiral of attacks that would not stop till the target was killed. The tip of the sword penetrated the nightmare panther's body, but the creature did not flee at all. The shadows grew more viscous as they wrapped around the blade, making Richard feel like it had suddenly sunk into a marsh. Even moving a single step proved to be difficult. Richard reacted instantly, however. He let out a loud cry as he placed both hands on the sword, energy bursting forth from his entire body as the fourth moon took its place atop his head instead. The moon force at the edge of the blade turned blue instead of silver. The fourth secret sword, Annihilation. The room was suddenly filled with gleaming blue moonlight that tore all the shadows apart. Richard's body crashed into the nightmare panther, the energy tearing it completely apart. As the creature died, he finally managed to shatter the countless shadows apart. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 76. The First Visit, 2. The blade flew through the air without pause, halting only when it was buried into the opposite wall up to the hilt. Richard maintained his stance, finally letting out a deep breath that he'd saved up. Immense fatigue flooded his body, nearly drowning out his consciousness. Sweat poured out of him like a torrent, instantly drenching his clothes as he swayed on the verge of collapse. Were he not holding tightly onto the hilt of his sword, it was likely he wouldn't even be able to stand in place. He'd used up all of his energy to deal those two blows, bringing out his fullest in the face of impending death. However, this meant that he had drained practically every bit of his strength to do so. Thud, Ganger suddenly shuttled through the room's door, and Waterflower, who was a step earlier, stood silently against the wall. The two of them looked at the chaos in the bedroom, but for a moment they didn't understand what exactly had happened. They looked at the window simultaneously, as if in sync with each other. That was the only exit, but the window was half closed and the curtains were not drawn. Everything looked perfectly intact, and it didn't seem like any enemies had fled the scene. There were no traces within the room either. Flozin rushed into the room right after, and as she took in the surroundings, her face instantly fell. She squatted down, looking at a few inconspicuous scratches on the floor before reaching out to touch them. They resembled the claws of a beast, and these ones had come from the nightmare panther. There were still remnants of shadow force left behind, something she clearly managed to notice. Nightmare creatures? She asked, her tone somber for once. Richard nodded, before lowering his head to look at his own chest. The clothes covering his chest had split open, revealing 3 long cuts. Fine red lines had appeared on his bare skin, eventually splitting apart to reveal the flesh underneath. The incisions were extremely even and smooth, penetrating all the way through his body and only stopping at his ribs. A moment later, Richard collapsed on his back amidst a spurt of blood. A day had passed by the time Richard eventually woke up. He was laid on his bed, his chest wrapped snugly with bandages. The bandages were tight but not painful, a display of outstanding technique that could only have come from Flozan. He tried to move, but his chest immediately started hurting, so he had no choice but to lie back down. This was another distressing thing about nightmare creatures: spell resistance. Shadow force lingered on in the wounds of those they injured, able to counter the healing energy of magic and divine spells and diminish the effects of even greater heals. Those injuries inflicted by powerful nightmare creatures could render such spells useless until one found a way to disperse the shadow force. Otherwise, one could only wait for the power to dissipate on its own. The only choice would be to use herbal medicine to boost the body's natural healing, trying to recover normally. As a result, many who sustained serious injuries from nightmare creatures ended up dying helplessly or being crippled due to the lack of treatments. Dim light began to seep into the room, indicating that it was the crack of dawn. Everything outside was quiet, with no movements at all. Most people were still sound asleep. Bedridden as he was, Richard couldn't help but think back to the battle with the Nightmare Panther. Nightmare creatures had no physical presence, relying on their powers to advance or retreat. The crouching was only to confuse the opponent. The attack had already begun. Richard had read up as much as he could about nightmare creatures once he found out about his situation, and his powerful intellect clearly retained all the information he had acquired. Thus, he immediately launched his own attack when he saw the Nightmare Panther crouch. Had he delayed any further, it wouldn't have been as simple as getting clawed in the chest. Since they had no physical presence, regular attacks did not affect nightmare creatures. Fortunately, he could still draw upon Alucia's power in this plane. The damage the moon force inflicted upon the creature was evident as well, and this calmed him down a little. He knew now he would not be completely helpless in any future encounters. Nightmare panthers were amongst the weakest of nightmare creatures. Since one had already appeared, more would be soon to follow. In the future, the battles would not be as simple as this one was. Lying quietly on the bed, Richard began to recall every detail of his battle with the Nightmare Panther over and over again. The fight had ended in a short instant, but Richard knew better deep down. He could feel himself being pushed forth by the formidable power of the blue moon force bursting forth from the edge of his sword to boost annihilation to the next level. The explosive power had thoroughly shattered all the shadow force the panther had managed to gather. And despite all that, the panther's claws had reached his chest before it was destroyed. The blades of energy that came from its paw had made their way right into his body, leaving a strange icy sensation coursing through him as his flesh was sliced apart. Any deeper and the creature would have cut his ribs open, stabbing into his heart. With the spell resistance of shadow force, the rupture of his heart would have been incurable. Flozan, only level 9 still, definitely would not be able to salvage the situation. His soul shuddered at the prospect of another close shave with death. Richard wasn't afraid of risk, but that did not mean he didn't fear death itself. Death was the end of everything. He had many hopes to fulfill, and boundless prospects ahead for him in the vast future. If he died, all of that would boil down to nothing. Far too much in the boundless plains was still undiscovered. There were a lot of exciting and wonderful moments he had yet to experience in his mortal life. The more important a character was, the more unwilling they would be to die. This was not simply due to fear. They held responsibilities, worries, and a great deal of unfulfilled wishes in their hearts. And thus, Richard savored the fear of his brush with death repeatedly to strengthen his endurance. He hoped to overcome this fear one day, and face it with ease. The calmer he was when coping with death, the greater his chances of survival would be. Although he wasn't afraid of risk without any assurance turned courage into foolishness. One who charged forth despite a slim chance of victory were not wise. These 2 days had been unsettling. He'd endured the will of Bloodstone, witnessed Waterflower's breakthrough and her new skill. He'd also gone through a life and death battle with a nightmare creature, employing 2 secret swords in succession alongside Eruption to eliminate the first of many that would arrive from some foreign place. He had suffered a close shave with death once more. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 77. Inspiration. Recalling the incidents of the past 2 days, as well as everything that had happened ever since he entered Phalar, Richard felt like his blood was boiling. The inspiration from his conversation with Flozan appeared once more, this time growing clearer and clearer by the moment. It was like a playful wisp of fire, tempting him continuously but not letting him catch it. He didn't hurry it along, instead stopping to ponder quietly. At that moment, all the lessons in philosophy from the deep blue passed through his mind. Your thinking dictates everything. The words that almost every teacher of his shouted before dismissing the class reverberated through his head. He realized that he was passively responding to the changes in his surroundings, rarely thinking of the path he was prepared to take. The pursuit of power was an empty catchphrase. A realistic question would be to ask what means he could take to obtain that strength, and how far he could go. As far as he could see, the laws on Failure and Norland were quite similar. Although the limit of Failure's power was lower than Norland's, it was still a plane that could produce people of legendary might. At the very least, he himself was far from being suppressed by the laws. However, the many battles had revealed several other key differences between the planes. An enemy who seemed comparable to them on the surface would be easy to win against, and in fact most of the time it was without any issue. Outside of Flozan, he himself, the brood mother, waterflower, Gangder, and other unique factors, one other stark difference between the two planes had already reared its head. Runes. The art of runecrafting that Norland had developed over millennia was the ultimate manifestation of the application of magic for war. Gangder with a single rune could compete against opponents who were 2 to 3 levels higher than him for a short duration, and if he had a complete set of runes that suited him he could easily defeat even a level 14 Stormhammer. Any standard rune knight that he built up with his knowledge would be able to compare to a same class of Failure. Knights at level 13 to 14 would be pushed to level 17, some even to level 18. It was as though a large number of powerhouses could be created out of thin air. If at equal numbers Failure could perhaps resist Norland's might, the appearance of runes and armies of rune knights that were thousands strong all comparable to same classes would easily tear this plane's resistance apart. As for he himself, his talent, position, resources. Most of what made him unique came from runes. It was only then that Richard understood the importance of his philosophy classes. It wasn't to show him a constant path to success, instead to teach him a framework for his thought process that would elevate him. With the answer found, inspiration came naturally. The spark floating before him was completely within reach, and could be grabbed with a stretch of the hand. And thus he stretched out, grabbing hold of this spark to come to a realization. However, even after capturing the inspiration, Richard refused to let go. On the contrary, his grip grew stronger as he rubbed it, the feeling of that flame disappearing from his mind. His hand began to feel a soft elasticity. At that moment, Flozan's hoarse voice rang in his ears, "You're pinching my rear." "It can't be." Richard opened his eyes to see Flozan beside his bed. "I'm grabbing a hold of inspiration." He did not let go, instead pinching it harder a few times. "What about now, then?" she asked. "Is it still a mistake?" He smirked in response. "Now? I'm touching your butt, of course." Flozan took a step closer to the bedside, allowing him to easily touch more of her. She also asked, "Do you want me to take off my clothes? But looking at your current health, it doesn't really seem suitable." Richard snorted, stretching out and smacking her rear. The exertion affected the wound on his chest, however, and his face paled with pain. Enduring it with much effort, Richard let out a breath of turbid air. "Heal me quickly, I know you have a way." Flozan removed the bandage on his body as she spoke. "I just thought of a way, but it won't be able to solve the root of the problem. Shadow Force is not simple. Its origin is more profound than that of any deity on this plane." The wound on his chest was aired, but it revealed that the 3 slashes hadn't closed up. The bleeding was only stopped due to thick ointment, and Shadow Force lingered around that as well. Richard felt a faint darkness in the corner of his vision. Flozan took out a bottle of colorless water. However, the overflowing mana it showed upon removal indicated that this was far from ordinary. "This will hurt a bit, bear with it." Richard nodded without much worry. His will was quite firm, and he was confident of his tolerance for pain. Flozan tilted the bottle in her hand, pouring the water onto Richard's wound. The moment it came into contact with the lingering shadow force, it was as though it had been poured into a hot pan. It instantly started boiling, splattering everywhere as it released large amounts of mist. At that instant, the severe pain caused Richard to black out. His body abruptly jumped off the bed, before falling back down once more. This was an instinctive reaction to the severe pain. He also opened his mouth wide, his face beginning to distort. Being able to hold it in without screaming was already his limit, but he still let out a few guttural roars. How was this a bit? This was clearly torture. And yet, the holy water had eliminated all traces of the shadow force on the wound. Traces of black lines could be seen entangled with holy light, reluctantly fading into the mist. Flozin began chanting, and 2 greater heals fell upon Richard's body. The wound on his chest closed up at a visible speed under the magic's effect, and in the next 2 to 3 days it would heal completely. Following that, Flozin continued her chants. This time the spell took 3 to 4 times longer than a greater heal, and the mana consumed was just as great. A ray of divine light fell upon Richard's body, causing the searing pain to fade in an instant. This was Restoration, a grade 5 spell. Greater heals only affected surface injuries, unable to fix bones or internal damage. This was where Restoration came in. The Nightmare Panther had penetrated Richard's chest, leaving a row of incisions on his ribs. Without Restoration, it would take as long as 3 months for him to recover. Flozin immediately grew weak after she cast Restoration. She knelt down, her upper body lying on his bedside. However, Richard had just healed from his injuries, and the baptism of the holy water had left him leaking cold sweat. At that moment, he didn't even have the strength to sit up. Both of these weakened bodies ended up leaning against each other. Finally calming his breathing a little, Richard asked, "Flozin, the holy water didn't feel right." Flozin nodded, answering lazily a few moments later, "What's wrong with holy water that has divine power infused? It's a little painful, I admit, but isn't it very effective?" "How is that a little?" Richard didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He barely lifted his hand to comb through Flozin's hair. "Why do I feel the god of valor's power in it, Well, it's holy water with divine power infused." "Did I say it came from the eternal dragon? Where did it come from, though?" "I don't remember taking any from the church." Richard was puzzled. "Didn't I take a lot of scrolls? I gained some understanding of Nyan's power, so I infused it into the holy water while I was modifying those scrolls. That way, I wouldn't be wasting the extracted energy." Richard was taken aback. "You can steal divine power? Isn't that something normal?" Flozin stated, "As a matter of fact, it's no big deal. Only the people of this plane think that the deities are omniscient, omnipotent, and cannot be deceived. It isn't difficult to make use of the power of a lesser deity like Nyan. Speaking of, there's someone named Theodore who really excelled in this field. Not only could he steal divine power, he could even deceive gods themselves and intercept faith. Forget small fry like Nyan, he managed to deceive the gods of a primary plane. Right, he's been living in the deep blue all these years. I remember you said you attended his class before." Richard was rendered speechless. Such words could come from anyone, but uttered by a priestess herself made him feel an indescribable sense of discomfort. Theodore had given him an impression of someone knowledgeable and somewhat dull. He hadn't expected the man to be so remarkable as to intercept divine faith itself. Be careful to avoid his detection. We're still in his territory, and aren't ready to withstand divine punishment yet, he warned seriously. Yes. Flozin nodded firmly, looking obedient and adorable. She didn't seem one bit like someone who would dare to steal divine power. We need to stay here for a month longer, I have some matters to attend to. It might be faster, but a month at most, Richard said. Flozin was a bit surprised. Is it something important? I thought we were going to leave this place already. Yes, very important. How important? Richard lifted Flosan's chin, staring into her bottomless amber eyes. Extremely. So important that if I succeed, you can prepare to resist. I'm always ready, Flosan smiled. Only after another entire day of rest could Richard move freely, and he headed straight for Waterflower's room when he got out of bed. His soul guard had been moved to the largest room on this floor as per his instructions, with 2 adjacent rooms opened up completely to give her a huge space of more than 200 square meters. It was already deep into the night, but Richard moved his work table and tools into the young lady's room. His table was filled with all sorts of magic materials. The girl stood in the center of the room, looking like an ethereal spirit. There were no lights within, the only illumination being the rays of moonlight shining through the window. The moonlight reflected off her, making her look even more beautiful and unearthly. Waterflower knew that Richard was crafting runes for her, and it filled her with a strong sense of anticipation and some nervousness. Richard took a deep breath and let it out, calming himself down before hinting for the young lady to remove her clothes. Waterflower was stunned by the request, hesitant to complete it. She seemed to think of something quite quickly, however, beginning to remove all her clothes to stand before him fully naked. This was a near-perfect body. Her smooth skin was unblemished, the 2 average breasts perky and her legs slender and long. Unlike Flosan, Waterflower's body was filled with a sense of strength. However, it also seemed illusionary as though enveloped in layers of mist. Scanning over her with a spell, Richard walked up to Waterflower and circled around her. He closely observed every inch of her skin as close as possible, muttering to himself, "This is truly a work of God, it's supreme art. It seems like the concept will work out." At that moment, Richard was completely immersed in the wonderful world of runes and magic. He didn't notice the young lady's breathing growing more rapid, nor her body trembling slightly. At that moment, every part of this perfect body was radiating a magical light. Her carrying capacity was so great that he would go crazy. Although Waterflower hadn't unlocked anything else from her bloodline upon reaching level 10, her rune capacity had increased. She was now on par with Flosan in that regard. In Richard's eyes, Waterflower was the ideal rune knight that any rune master could only dream of. By this point he'd made it behind her, half squatting with his face less than 10 centimeters away from her body. His gaze slowly moved down, tracing the curve of her butt. This beautiful line fit perfectly with the idea for a rune that he had in his mind. He was engulfed in happiness for a moment, and couldn't help stretching out to touch that perfect skin. However, the girl's body heated up the moment his fingertips made contact. It seemed as though an intense flame had been ignited within her body. Originally lost in the world of runes, Richard suddenly felt his heart clench. Before his body could respond, the world was turned upside down, shaking hard. A loud bang sounded out as various lights flashed in his vision. All his internal organs seemed to be displaced, the pain from the severe impact excruciating. However, things were not over. He felt a sharp pain in his rear, and in that moment he could see Waterflower killing him. "Stop!" he screamed. At that moment, the girl was already pressing down on his back with one hand, the other trained against his but in preparation to strike. It wouldn't matter even if there were no steel spikes in the Archaran death camps, because her hands were actually even more powerful. There was more than one fellow who had his intestines ripped out by her hand. With the loud exclamation, Waterflower awoke from her shock. Her mind being blank before, she'd moved on instinct, and only now did she realize what she had done. She immediately pulled back at the speed of lightning, her entire person silently retreating a few meters. She stood straight, staring down at an area 10 centimeters in front of her feet. She looked so well behaved it was as if nothing had happened just now. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 78. Breath of Darkness. Richard struggled to stand up, a stinging pain burning his shoulder. Thankfully he could still walk, meaning his injuries weren't too severe. Unaware that his clothes were already in tatters, he reached his hand behind himself only to feel something warm and damp. When he pulled it back, all he could see was fresh crimson blood. "Waterflower!" he rebuked angrily. The girl shivered ever so slightly, but she made no attempt to move. It was almost as if she'd heard nothing, her expression blank. However, this was only proof that she was far from calm in her heart. Even if the girl was one of few words and expressions, her eyes were rarely so empty. Most of the time she observed her surroundings with the gaze of a hunter eyeing its prey. Richard tried to move, finding that it wasn't too bad. The injuries were minor cuts that didn't affect his mobility, and would heal easily with a lesser heal. Even without the use of magic, they would heal in 3 to 5 days. However, the problem was this: how was he to account to Flozin about these injuries? He could already imagine what a laughingstock he would become once the priestess found out. Were he to one day grow famous as a saint runemaster, he was sure that this woman would publish a book titled The Secret History of the Saint and include all the details of this event within. Passing his deeds down through generations, she could earn a bit of fame as well. In fact, as a cleric of the Eternal Dragon, she could do much more than just spreading this tale far and wide. It was quite possible that she would put this book in the Church of the Eternal Dragon. Sighing, Richard just tended to his wounds and decided to let them heal on their own. Clenching his teeth, he walked towards Waterflower, inspecting her body once more as some of his concepts gained added details. Once he got to work, the episode gradually slipped from his mind, and he immersed himself in the world of runes. A short while later, he started to mess up the room in a mad frenzy, haphazardly setting several chairs in the middle to form obstacles. He then had the girl demonstrate her skill, wind walk. Once again Waterflower floated up like a specter, and the faster she flew, the less of a hindrance the obstacles became. At times the obstacles only supported her, or became objects to defend herself with. By now she was completely naked. Every move she made, the relaxation of every inch of her skin, it was all clearly revealed in front of Richard. The girl's body had a wonderful cycle of tensing and relaxing, with most of her time spent loose and extended as she glided through the air. Her body then curled up tightly, tapping lightly on the next place she would land. Her beautiful silhouette would then burst forth with immense power, catapulting out like a hunting wolf. The entire process was silent and wordless, the darkness embracing her as always. Indeed, the girl was a ruler of shadows in complicated environments. With the last of his inspiration acquired, Richard waved for her to stop and had her lie down in bed. He didn't bother spending the time to light a lamp, illuminating the room with a spell as he grabbed his pen. The girl lay quietly on her back as Richard used his pen, pricking her calf to draw elegant and complicated lines. Time passed quietly in the tranquil night. One pen replaced another, and bit by bit the materials were slowly emptied into her calf. The illumination spell faded an hour into the task, but Richard still wouldn't spare the few seconds it would take to light a lamp. He instead just cast another spell and continued on. Someone knocked on the door at dawn, seemingly to ask about breakfast. However, they were immediately turned away by a "Don't disturb me." Richard hadn't even listened to them. He'd prepared a total of 37 pens, and by the time he was through every one of them the sky had grown dark once more. Waterflower had beautiful patterns all over her right leg, all the way from the knee to the ankle. Most of the tattoo was blue and black, but there was an occasional deep violet as well. Setting the brush down, Richard felt slightly faint. A whole night of high-intensity work had completely depleted his power, leaving him with no choice but to take a short break. A night of meditation didn't just recover Richard's mana. He also gained a deeper awareness of the world of magic, inspiration surging once more as he developed even more ideas for the girl's rune set. He thus took out all of his materials, including the piece of maple amber. Carefully slicing a third of it off with a mithril knife, he grinded the gem into powder before dissolving it into the rest of his ink. The mix was allowed to rest for an hour and then filtered, purifying and boosting its power. An entire afternoon passed before he had the ink for his pen. The pen could hold a mere 3 drops of ink, but these 3 drops of liquid alone were worth over 10,000 gold of raw material. Besides, not just anyone could even produce it, that was limited to grand alchemists or rune masters. The time and labor involved would easily add another 50,000 to the price. At that moment, the pale gold pen in Richard's hand turned transparent. The magical ink could be seen sloshing around within, almost as if it had a life of its own. Maple amber had a special characteristic in that it was quite lively. Popular belief was that the gem was formed by the crystallization of the blood of powerful ancient beings upon their death. This ingredient exponentially increased the magical properties of the runes it was used in, equal to roughly a single grade's increase. It was commonly used for grade 3 runes as well, sometimes even for grade 4. This was why maple amber was much more expensive than most other grade 2 ingredients. Once the ink was prepared, it would only be effective for an hour. This was like the blood of some mythical creatures. Outside of their body, its use would drop quickly. Richard didn't dare to dally, heading directly for Waterflower's room. Once she undressed, he had her stand straight and started with a dot on her knee. The line he drew was extremely long, extending all the way to her thigh and belly before going down the other leg all the way to her ankle. The second started from her stomach, crossing the first before moving up across her left breast to her shoulder. It split in 2 at the back of her neck, stretching to the back of her ears. The third line started from the stomach as well, going to her right breast, shoulder, and ending up at the middle finger of her right hand. Just drawing these 3 lines left Richard drenched in sweat once more. The ink in the pen had almost run dry as well. "Get some rest, we'll continue in an hour." If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 79. Breath of Darkness, 2. Waterflower may have had an hour to rest, but Richard did not. He busied himself preparing the inks for the next phase the moment he returned to his room. His pen pricked her knee once again after the hour passed, and time passed in silence. By the time the rune was completed, another night had passed. The young lady's legs were completely covered with complex magical patterns, giving off a mysterious aura. Richard stretched his weary body, looking at the rune he'd completed himself with a smile. "Move around and try it out, don't use windwalk." The girl was a little puzzled, but she complied and leapt off the bed. Her speed picked up after a gentle landing, and she bolted towards a chair as quick as lightning. Without windwalk, she was supposed to slow down and change directions to avoid the obstacle. However, this time something activated in her mind as the rune on her legs twinkled slightly. She automatically stepped over the chair, striding over it with ease. Her movements were fluid and natural despite her speed, and she showed no signs of slowing down at all. The rune was only so big. The frenzied dash at full speed brought her to the wall in an instant, but even then she kept going. She gracefully dashed up the opposing surface, keeping her momentum going as she even took several quick steps on the ceiling before jumping down to land in front of Richard. It was only then that she showed a look of surprise, lowering her gaze to her legs. The radiance of the rune there was slowly fading. She moved suddenly once more, erupting into a chaos of swift movement around the room as she constantly brushed past the runemaster at the center. It was as though she was a ghost, the obstacles in the room not slowing her down in the slightest. This speed was only slightly inferior to windwalk itself. Back in front of Richard again, the surprise in her eyes had transformed into amazement. This is Call of the Wild. It can allow you to move easily through most complex landscapes with a minimal loss in speed. It also enhances your acceleration, allowing you to keep your speed up even over sand, stones, or marshes. It also lets you move uphill faster than you used to. To the young lady who was adept at moving in forested areas, using darkness to land a single lethal blow, this enhancement to her mobility was a straight boost to her combat power. "Thank you." Despite remaining expressionless, Waterflower finally managed to force the 2 words through her teeth. Richard laughed in reply, "There's no need to thank me, we're 2 parts of a whole. Besides, this is only the first." There's still 4 more to come. You'll have to bear with me for the next 2 weeks. Alright, I'll go get some rest. I haven't slept properly for a few days in a row now. 4 more runes? Waterflower's body jolted slightly, her lowered eyelids slightly trembling. Watching as Richard left the room, she clenched her teeth and began in the most unnatural and stiff manner, Your injury. Does it hurt? Richard's laughter ground to a halt, and he threw a glare the girl's way. She grew uneasy, understanding that she'd said something wrong. This matter. Don't ever mention it again. Richard huffed angrily, slamming the door to leave the room. However, his gait still didn't look natural. Things rarely went according to one's wish. Even back at his room to rest, Richard didn't get any peace. The source of his distress was naturally Flozan, the only one in his party with the right to enter and leave his room at will. Flozan stared intently at Richard as he was about to go sleep. You don't look too good. I'm just tired, Richard replied casually. Nope, that's not it. You're injured? Flozan clearly wasn't that easy to dupe. No. Richard's voice grew in pitch. Where's the injury? She insisted, reaching out to undo his clothes. Let me see. There's really no injury. Richard grew furious. You can think of bluffing a cleric of the Eternal Dragon after you have 10 more levels on you. Flozan shot back sharply. She absolutely wouldn't give in when it came to the matter of his injuries. However, something else suddenly occurred to Flozan. Richard hadn't headed out in the past few days, so how did he get injured? He was clearly crafting a rune for Waterflower all this while. As his process came to mind, she blurted out without thinking, How did you get injured? Did you not explain clearly what you were doing? So she instinctively retaliated. She stopped abruptly after bringing up the matter. Her unintentional words were infinitely close to the truth, and the memory of Waterflower's usual target instantly sealed her mouth shut. Her gaze towards Richard changed, as a smile curled up at the corner of her lips. Richard grew livid, grabbing Flozan and throwing her out. He then closed the door with a thud. However, gentle and even knocking rang out only a moment later. Richard begrudgingly opened the door, yelling, What do you want? Sure enough, Flozan was still at the door. Her smile made it seem like flowers were blooming everywhere. I can treat minor injuries. I need to cast a lesser heal. Richard looked up at the ceiling for a bit, before gritting his teeth and dragging her into the room with a tug. He then slammed the door shut with a heavy thud. 10 hours later, Richard made his way over to Waterflower's room in large strides, prepared to continue his rune crafting. The rest seemed to have a rather positive effect, at least Waterflower couldn't spot anything amiss from the way he walked. What followed were 2 more days without rest. An expanse of silver patterns was added to Waterflower's chest and abdomen, covering her vital parts and enhancing the defense of her body. This was another custom rune from Richard, True Silver Ornament. It would provide just as much protection as a suit of refined armor. Outside of that, this new rune also strengthened her magic resistance, especially towards nature magic. Waterflower did not like to wear armor, her skills brought out to the fullest when she was clad in light clothing. Some advanced magic could track its target, while some other spells affected an entire area. The ability to resist magic was of utmost importance to her. Resting for another 10 hours, Richard then started on his 3rd rune. This one was at her head, behind the ears. 2 matchlessly fine and elaborate runes decorated either side of her head, each only the size of a fingertip. The Dark Sight rune had one simple function, affording Waterflower up to 30 meters of vision in the dark. Since the young lady could already see in the dark to some extent, her range went up to a total of 50 meters. As she advanced in levels, the range would continue to grow. It had taken Richard about a day and a half to complete Dark Sight. He then rested once more, beginning the next rune when he was ready. This one would be drawn on her right forearm. This rune was a dull, dark gray, looking like a bunch of curled-up petals. Passively, it boosted Waterflower's ability to hide her breathing, and when she launched attacks it also imbued some properties of Shadow Force into the attack. This was an additional boost to her power. Shadow Seal. The inspiration for the rune had come from his near-death battle with the Nightmare Panther, thus the origin of the name. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 80. Breath of Darkness, 3. Call of the Wild, True Silver Ornament, Dark Sight, and finally Shadow Seal. These were all custom designs, and although they were only grade 1, they served to accent the user's abilities. They weren't normal runes that just enhanced a particular attribute. Technically, they would be classified as somewhere between grade 1 and grade 2, and moreover they had all been tailored to Waterflower's abilities. Not only had Richard considered her combat style and special abilities, he'd also optimized the positioning of each rune to fuse them together perfectly with her. Nobody else could make use of them as well as she could. However, that was not the end. He drew an additional dark purple rune on her solar plexus, pouring out all of his inspiration. Counterguard would form the heart of Waterflower's rune set. It was designed to increase her mental and spiritual defenses, allowing her to more easily aid Richard in case of a soul attack. As the core of the set, it took him 5 days to craft it. Once done, all the magic patterns were ignited, the runes combining to form the complete set. Once the runes joined, the set gained another ability, Breath of Darkness. When activated, Waterflower would perfectly meld into her surroundings, her attacks growing more lethal as the shadow damage of her attacks growing even more powerful. Once she activated this ability, she would truly become a nightmare for her opponents. This was the first rune set he had ever crafted. The Breath of Darkness had been completed. A short while later, he summoned Flozin to Waterflower's room. Explaining everything from Call of the Wild to Counterguard, he followed up, once the 5 runes combine, a new ability is formed. I've named the set after this, calling it the Breath of Darkness as well. This is only the start. The set was built to be extensible, developed and strengthened sometime in the future. The whole series will be called the Savagery of Darkness. Having said that, he allowed Waterflower some time to change before summoning Gangder to the backyard. The two would test out the Breath of Darkness in real combat. It was still late at night. The messy courtyard was Waterflower's favorite kind of environment. However, the girl had placed a full set of knight's armor on a wooden rack nearby, not telling anyone what it was for. Hearing he would be fighting Waterflower, Gangder roared with delight. The axe in his hands began to tremble. Ever since his powers had been enhanced with a rune, he hadn't heartily engaged in combat. Moreover, both he and Waterflower were raised in the death training camp. They understood each other very well. In his heart, she was definitely one of his most dangerous opponents. With her recent advancement and the 5 tailor-made runes, how much more powerful had she become? However, even if he was laughing boorishly, Gangder had long since removed that one of in his heart. She was definitely his greatest opponent. The young lady was adorned in white, standing in front of him with a sense of majesty. She emitted an extremely unfamiliar aura in the night, as if she was only partly visible in the darkness. It made it difficult to grasp her position. Out of habit, Gangder let out a few hearty laughs. He rubbed his bald head and suddenly waved his axe, speaking seriously. Waterflower, let me say this in advance, you're not allowed to use that steel spike. A coarse and rusty spike appeared in the girl's hand, none the wiser as to where it had previously been hidden. The young girl threw it out lazily, and with a boom the spike was embedded into the yard's wall. She then slowly drew the Shepherd of Eternal Rest, holding it with both hands. The blade was pointed at the floor and her heel was slightly raised as she stared at Gangder with both eyes, her short hair lifting even in the absence of wind. Gangder put both hands on his own axe, growing silent. He bent both knees, bursting forth with a cold and imposing aura, but it was as though the aura pushed Waterflower's hair up. However, her figure did not float up alongside it, instead slowly disappearing into the darkness. Before she could vanish completely, Gangder let out a strange cry. He swung his axe horizontally, bringing it beside his body. A soft ding rang out, the Shepherd of Eternal Rest quietly appearing from within the darkness to strike the big axe. Waterflower's silhouette appeared by Gangder's side, but it grew fuzzy again before he could even see her clearly. Asterisk ding. Ding, asterisk Gangder swung twice behind him, barely managing to block Waterflower's next two blows. However, even before he could retrieve his axe, her blade had appeared in front of him once more. This time, it was much faster. Waterflower was as fast as lightning, scurrying between Gangder's front and back as she rained a torrent of blows upon Gangder. She used Wind Walk to completely suppress him with her movement, leaving him without time even to block her hits. All he could do was force all the power out of his runes, hoping the increased strength could let him spin his axe faster. His only hope at this point was to become a windmill, but whether that would protect him all depended on luck. His heart suddenly felt an unspeakable chill, and Gangder was stunned for a moment as the icy, beautiful face of Waterflower appeared clearly before his eyes. However, that clarity only existed for a fleeting moment before the young lady flew past him like the wind, the Shepherd of Eternal Rest flashing in her hand. Gangder stood rooted in place, while Waterflower appeared a few meters away. She quietly stood tall despite being a little short of breath. Her strength was almost completely used up, but the battle had long since come to a close. Gangder slowly turned around. Around 2 meters behind him was the set of full armor, in the same position Waterflower had originally placed it in. He'd thought she wanted to use the armor as an obstacle to give her an advantage in battle, but he realized now that it was not the case. A slanted crack suddenly appeared on the armor, following which the bottom silently split off. The rest of the armor crashed down to the floor, the clamor extremely loud in the silent night. The hazy moonlight revealed a glimmering cut in the armor. Gangder's throat suddenly trembled violently. He swallowed down a wad of saliva, his complexion growing extraordinarily unbearable. Had Waterflower targeted him with the blow instead of that armor, he knew clearly that he would have met the same fate. At that moment, the young lady had become the ultimate opponent. By Richard's side, Flozen suddenly let out a gentle sigh. Richard paused for a while before asking, "What are you thinking about?" The breath of darkness far surpassed even his own imagination. As long as it was in the night, Waterflower could even destroy Stormhammer at his peak with her current prowess. Flozen maintained her own dazzled expression for a while before speaking. "I was just thinking of a few hundred years ago, when Runemaster Lugatti showed off the first ever rune set. Ah, what a grand scene that must have been. That set was what brought Rune Knights to the mainstream." Richard let out a faint smile. "My only concern now is whether or not you'll resist me in the future." Flozen threw a glance back at him, speaking firmly and with determination, "I won't let you get it easily. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 2, Chapter 81. An Endless War. Their last night in Camp Bloodstone. It seemed quiet and peaceful, but in the inn things were far from being so. A loud bang sounded as Flosan's lithe body was sent flying across Richard's bedroom, landing on his bed. Richard's throw was calculated and meticulous. He'd used the bare minimum strength to send her the entire distance, not slamming her against the wall or otherwise hurting her. Nonetheless, the cleric was left crouching over the bed panting, apparently unable to get up. The robes covering her body were torn and tattered beyond recognition, exposing her snowy shoulders and almost half of her back in naked glory. The bottom half had been ripped to shreds, displaying her alluring thighs as her toes dug into the sheets. Richard scoffed, seeing through her act. Of course he'd be gravely wrong to think she would let him have his way so easily. His previous experiences had taught him well, he wouldn't be fooled by her tricks this time around. He took off his clothes without much hurry, showing off a perfect body that was beyond his age and occupation. He then slowly ambled to the side of the bed, asking, "Did I hurt you?" Flozen kept her face buried in the sheets, moaning softly in reply. Richard took the chance to grab onto her ankle, tugging her towards him before peeling off the remainder of her clothes and getting into position. Just as he was about to start his enjoyment, her legs wrapped around his waist and pulled him in, causing their bodies to collapse against each other. Her legs were unusually strong, pulling their bodies into an intimate distance. A 10-centimeter change from their previous position quickly turned the tables, as the sly girl attacked his groin. Flozen controlled her strength perfectly, causing great amounts of pain to the boy opposite her but without leaving any trauma or lasting injury. Nevertheless, it wasn't a good feeling for one's privates to be attacked. Richard groaned internally, his head spinning with rage. Flozen was still bursting with energy, supporting herself against the bed to flip him over in a split second before landing gracefully. This was definitely not the weak physique of a cleric. Flozen ran for the door the moment her feet touched the ground, obviously wanting to escape. However, her fingers barely grazed the doorknob before her body was yanked backwards. Thinking of running, Richard said petulantly, dragging her back. The pair entangled once again, becoming a mess that fell to the bed. Flozen managed to wriggle out another time, but this time things weren't in her favor. She'd landed in front of one of the room's corners, and before she took the chance to run, Richard had already cut her off. Just as she'd said to him, she wouldn't let him have it so easily. It had been a while since this battle for dominance started, and the cleric had proved her melee skills over and over again. She practiced something similar to wrestling, her strength and direction unpredictable. Her great agility and flexibility only served to elevate her technique to another level. Richard had only learned later that the priestesses of the Church of the Eternal Dragon were trained in self-defense just in case they were ambushed from behind. However, that training proved to be his biggest obstacle. And yet, the more familiar he grew with her techniques, the stronger and more targeted his counters were. This pushed Flozen into more of an unfavorable position every time. He'd almost gotten her in a few attempts, ripping her robes and garments apart to leave her with almost no defenses. The cleric was running out of stamina as the brawl continued. Richard was drenched in sweat himself, but that only hyped him up further. He was a man, the more fierce the resistance, the more excited he grew. It was growing harder and harder for Flozen to get herself out. Her struggles were finally put to an end as Richard held her down against the table. She twisted her body in an attempt to escape, but her strength was running out and she only managed to bounce up a little before being pushed back. He grabbed a hold of her hand and held it against her waist, before moving in. 2 screams rang out from the room at the same time. One was a man's bestial growl, while the other a woman's repeated pants of pain. Richard kept Flozen stuck beneath him, only lifting the pressure once he thrust it into her. He barely waited for her to catch a breath before going in once more, his movements rough and hard. It seemed like Flozen had finally reached her limits, bending over the table to bear the unending attack. The only thing she could do was let out soft moans here and there, her sweat soaking the wood. Richard himself almost reached climax in a short while, likely because of the intense battle that served as a precursor to this. He took a deep breath and halted his movements. This wasn't an easy prize, he couldn't end up finishing so quickly. However, Flozen, who looked drained of energy, suddenly took the chance to move her body, attempting to wriggle her way out of his grasp. An inexplicable feeling filled Richard as he roared, "What are you trying to do?" But then, he lost control of himself and released. He then leaned over Flozen's bare back, panting hard. The cleric lifted her head, caressing his face. "Nothing. I wanted to flee, but didn't get the chance." Richard fumed at the thought. She was thinking of fleeing in this manner? He stayed silent for a few more minutes before suddenly getting up, picking the priestess up and throwing her on the bed. He then got on top of her. It was now Flozen's turn to be shocked. She hadn't expected him to recover so quickly. Their second battle was especially intense, lasting a long time. According to Norland's military traditions, a raging first battle would be followed by a prolonged war. As for the third, Richard, sweating buckets at this point, lay next to Flozan and let out a snort. He then asked in high spirits, "Finally honest with your feelings this time, dot." Flozan laughed lightly, only answering with a vitality spell. The third battle would be a counterattack. The formerly oppressed party would mount a comeback, switching their positions completely. The night was still young when the third battle reached its end. The war had not concluded, especially with one party relentlessly provoking the other. The fourth battle inevitably began. This time, Richard gave it his all. By the time the sun finally rose, Richard was completely worn out and drowsy. On the other hand, Flozan was energetic as ever, exuding a radiance that made her look irrevocably beautiful in the light of dawn. She clung onto Richard without letting him sleep, intending to start a fifth battle. "What are you thinking about?" Flozan propped her chin onto Richard's chest and gazed at him expectantly. Her eyes were deep with meaning. "I was just reminded of times when I was younger," Richard replied weakly. "When you were younger?" Flozan was rather surprised at his answer, especially in a moment like this. "Yeah, I was still in Rusland back then with my mother. When I grew a little older, she let me help out with the herb farm. I watched the villagers farm as well. Rusland was a mountain village. The farmers raised magical bulls to spare manpower. This just reminded me of those times." "What about it?" Flozan grew even more curious, but she was sure that Richard was distracting her to avoid the fifth round. Richard turned his head to look at Flozan. He then flashed a vague smile. "I feel like I'm the bull and you're the farm. From my experience, bulls died from exhaustion but the farms never spoiled." And once again, the only reply he was met with was a vitality spell. Of course, his departure from Camp Bloodstone was delayed yet again. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 82. Oasis. Early morning 2 days later, Richard's troops left Camp Bloodstone. They made use of the cool morning air to hurry along to Bluewater Oasis, the closest oasis to this edge of the bloodstained lands. Their party now had more than 10 horses, a few carriages, and 30 half-orc warriors. The extra 10 had been given to Richard for his valiance in fighting on in terms of alcohol intake. It was also partly due to Flozan's scrolls. The unexpected experience with Stormhammer and the remaining half-orcs had changed Richard's views on these warriors. He'd originally planned to just treat them as cannon fodder, but now he would treat them as part of his core troops. As for Sam and Mark's other subordinates, they were tasked to stay behind at Camp Bloodstone. Their duty was to manage the spring and all the other businesses nearby. The parting words Richard had left Big Axe with were quite cheerful. "I always place enormous trust in my subordinates." Camp Bloodstone was roughly 80 kilometers away from Bluewater Oasis. However, this seemingly short journey was actually quite dangerous. Many caravans had used the oasis as a place to resupply and trade, and as the number of caravans heading there increased, bandits and robbers were naturally attracted to the place. Many big-time slave traders also found suitable opportunities to join these rogues and murderers. Richard's team was of moderate size. Although they had several carriages accompanying them, it was clear that these carriages held their own belongings and not goods for trade. The powerful robbery groups didn't think they were worth the effort. On top of that, the team had 2 heavily armored trolls, 30 orc warriors, and a dozen wind wolves following them. They seemed quite tribalistic. Most tribes believed in ancestral worship and held deep-seated notions about vengeance. Make an enemy of one, and their relentless blood feud would last generations. As such, bandits who plied their trade in the bloodstained lands were often afraid of provoking orcs unless they were confident of destroying the entire tribe. Even then, there were barely any benefits of doing so. Orcs were still primitive, without much material wealth. Most adults of the tribe were strong warriors, and destroying even the smaller tribe would require a lot of effort for little profit. Very few people were interested in such a lopsided business model. The Bloodstone orcs were actually an exception. Saint warriors had appeared amongst their ranks in several generations, allowing them to maintain firm control of Camp Bloodstone, which was a major crossroad. Even without any saints in Stormhammer's generation, the half-orc tribe had doubled in military strength since the last. What's more, the tribe was more open and orderly, not completely rejecting the influence of outsiders. That was why those like Bowen, Howie, and the like had any say in the camp. And it was precisely this openness that meant these outsiders would help in case the camp faced an external threat. More than half of the Bloodstone tribe's accumulated wealth over the past century had entered Richard's hands, most of it poured into the Breath of Darkness on Waterflower. Richard himself was only left with enough materials to craft 2 more runes, and even those would have limited might. Riding his warhorse, Richard squinted his eyes and closely inspected the stone forests and red earth of the blood-stained lands. The sun shone down brightly without obstruction, the air hot enough for the scenery to distort. This place was barren, yet many intelligent races survived here. In fact, they led very exciting lives. Nobody was sure of what would happen tomorrow, and as such everyone lived frantically, trying to accomplish many things at once. Bloodthirsty murder, sexual services, slave trade, even drugs, every conceivable crime could be found somewhere in this land. The harshness of the environment gave the people here tremendous energy and unlimited freedom. Such was the beauty of the bloodstained lands, the place was completely free, and as such the weak grew worse and the strong continued to grow unrestricted. Gazing at this blood-red land, Richard felt a sudden faint inspiration. All of his inspiration for the Savagery of Darkness series, aimed at lethal ambushes, had been poured into creating the Breath of Darkness. However, looking at the crimson sand and how people struggled to survive here, new feelings started to stir within his mind. Perhaps he still needed an opportunity, but he might be able to start on a brand new series of runes. As of yet, however, he had no idea whether he really would be able to do so, and what that signified. After the long, arduous battle with Flozen that brought them both pain and joy, he'd gotten to know this favored child of the Eternal Dragon a lot better. That understanding could give rise to another series of rune sets in the future. He was already at the point of capturing the essence of the first set, and he'd even thought of a name for it. Assuming all other circumstance remained the same, Richard believed Mystic Glory would be a series not at all inferior to the Savagery of Darkness. His mind occupied with such thoughts throughout the journey up to Bluewater Oasis, nothing eventful happened until they reached their destination. Bluewater was called an oasis, but it was actually a large freshwater lake that spanned a few hundred square kilometers. Underground springs had kept the place fed all these years, and it had never dried out. The humans and other similar races only occupied cities on the edge of the oasis. There were other creatures as well, with a large variety of unfathomable flora all around. There were likely many terrifying creatures swimming around in the depths of the clear blue water. Bluewater Oasis was merely 200 kilometers away from the Sequoia Kingdom, which was only a few days of travel. As such, food and other necessities could be brought over by caravans from the human kingdoms. This proximity also made it one of the Bloodstained Land's greatest hubs of slave trade.